was a rainy Saturday night, and a young woman was out at a busy downtown club with her boyfriend. They had been arguing for a very long time, and tonight was no different. Fed up with the constant fighting, she decided she did not want to be there anymore. She walked out into the pouring rain and called an Uber. Because of the downpour, she stood under a small building awning nearby to stay dry. A white car pulled up in front of her and came to a stop. She walked over, and the woman driving rolled down the window. The young woman asked if she was her Uber, and when the driver said yes, she asked for her name. The driver agreed, so the young woman got into the back seat. She asked the driver how she was doing, but the woman did not answer. When she did not hear a response, the young woman looked up from her phone. She noticed the woman had both hands firmly planted on the steering wheel, sitting in an incredibly stiff, upright position. She also had very curly hair and a dark skin complexion. The car drove down the street she usually took, but then it made a turn and headed in the exact opposite direction. She did not want to correct her immediately, thinking maybe she was taking a different route to avoid traffic. But as they got further away, her anxiety grew. She finally spoke up and told her she was going the wrong way. The driver replied in a thick, hard-to-understand accent that she was taking the highway instead. The young woman knew the highway was not a quicker route. Suddenly, her phone vibrated. She looked down and saw a notification from Uber saying, "Meet your driver now." She opened the app and saw her actual Uber had just arrived, and it was a black Nissan, not this white car. Panic set in. She began shouting at the driver that she was not her Uber and demanded to be let out. When the driver ignored her, she started yelling and pushing at the front seat. She tried to open the door, but the child's safety lock was on. After more frantic screaming, the driver finally looked in the rearview mirror, pulled over, and unlocked the doors. The young woman ran out into the rain. Her actual Uber driver called, and she got in his car, explaining everything. He stopped the car and told her she had just escaped a known sex trafficking trap. He explained that multiple fake Ubers, often driven by women to appear less intimidating, had been active in the area trying to lure victims. She realized how close she had come to disappearing. It was a terrifying reminder of how a single careless mistake on a dark, rainy night could have cost her her life. One night, after leaving a local bar, a young man was decently drunk and started messaging people on Tinder. A girl named Alicia messaged him back almost immediately, asking what he was doing. He replied that he was looking to hang out, and she invited him over to smoke, promptly sending her address. It seemed like the perfect, easiest match a guy could ask for. He called an Uber and got in the front seat since he was feeling talkative. The driver was a really cool guy, and they laughed as the young man explained he was on his way to meet a Tinder date. On the way, he texted Alicia, and her replies seemed completely normal. However, when they arrived, the driver remarked that the dark, empty house looked familiar and sketchy. There were no cars in the driveway, and all the lights were off. He warned the passenger to be careful. The young man got out, and the driver pulled down the block to wait. Walking up to the dark house, the young man tried the doorbell, but it did not work. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried calling Alicia, but the phone went straight to voicemail after one ring. Right after, she texted him, saying the door was open and to come inside. Just then, a sudden knock on the window made his heart stop. He looked and saw the blinds lift slightly, and a hand waving from the darkness inside. Before he could open the door, his phone rang from an unknown number. He answered, but instead of Alicia, it was his Uber driver, ordering him in a panicked voice to walk away immediately. The driver pulled back up to the house and told him to get in. As they sped away, the driver explained that the house was vacant, and just the previous month, someone had been lured there, robbed, and murdered. The driver had recognized the address from the news. The young man realized he had almost walked into a deadly trap, and he could not thank the driver enough. The next morning, when he was completely sober, the reality of how close he had come to being murdered was incredibly disturbing to think about, and he realized how lucky he was to have had such a vigilant driver who cared enough to stay and make sure he was safe. It was a quiet Monday night, which is usually a very slow night for rideshare drivers, so when a ride request popped up on his screen, the driver jumped on it. The passenger's name was listed as John. He drove across the neighborhood to a corner liquor store that was completely closed at this hour. There were two young men waiting on the corner, and when he pulled up, they got into the back seat. He confirmed the name John to make sure he had the right passenger, and then he started driving toward their destination. But he immediately felt uneasy. The two passengers whispered to each other constantly, and it was very odd. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, they would notice and stare directly back at him. He tried to ignore them, but he found himself looking back over and over again. He asked them where they were heading, but neither of them answered. He figured they didn't hear him because the back window was open and the wind noise was loud, so he asked again. This time, one of them yelled out, "Harris Avenue." The aggressive tone made it clear they didn't want to talk. The driver felt his anxiety rising, and his foot instinctively pressed a bit harder on the gas pedal, wanting to get them to their destination as fast as possible. When they finally reached the street, he pulled up to a rundown storefront where a group of men were standing. As he turned around to ask if this was the spot, his heart dropped. Both passengers had pulled creepy masks over their faces, similar to the masks from the movie The Purge. Suddenly, he felt something hard and cold press against the back of his shoulder. He assumed it was a gun. They ordered him to pull up closer to the men outside. He did as he was told, and 3 large men wearing the same masks approached his window, demanding his wallet. He handed it over immediately. The passengers got out, and all 5 masked men walked away, with one of them kicking his car door. The driver quickly sped off and reported the incident. It turned out the account info was fake and paid for with a stolen card. He lost $250, his ID, and his cards, but he was incredibly grateful to escape with his life and move on from that terrible night. After leaving a friend's lively Super Bowl party, a young man called an Uber to drive him home. When he opened the door and got in, there was already a guy wearing a baseball hat sitting in the back seat. The young man didn't say anything to acknowledge him, only saying a quick hello to the driver. He figured he must have accidentally called an Uber pool instead of a regular ride, so he didn't care. When they arrived at his house, the young man got out of the car and shut the door. But as the car started to drive away, he heard a second door slam on the other side. He stopped and saw the guy in the baseball hat standing in the street, facing his direction with his head down, so his hat completely covered his face. The young man asked what was going on, but the stranger didn't answer and just slowly started to walk away. Knowing something was wrong, the young man decided to walk around the block instead of going inside his house. He looked across the street and realized the stranger had crossed over and was walking in the same direction, matching his exact pace. When the young man reached the intersection and turned the corner, the stranger did the same thing. Suddenly, the stranger started to run. The young man's adrenaline kicked in, and he sprinted faster than he ever had in his life. Fortunately, he was faster and managed to put some distance between them. He ran to his backyard and hid in the darkness before the man could see where he went, then slipped inside his house. He immediately called the Uber driver to ask about the other passenger. The driver explained that the guy in the hat had claimed he personally knew the next passenger, which was why the driver allowed him to stay. The driver said he had the man's information and would report him, but the young man never found out what happened next. It was a terrifying experience that taught him to always be extremely cautious with his ride-share trips and never let his guard down when arriving home late at night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I worked at a CVS pharmacy open 24 hours a day. I had been there for 3 years and was one of the higher-ups. I agreed to take on the overnight shifts because I believed it would help my chances of getting a promotion and kept my boss happy. Only one employee worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, as that was all that was needed. The pharmacy closed early, and the store was dead until business picked up at 9 in the morning when the daytime staff arrived. The 2 evening shift employees before me would leave as soon as my shift started, so I was completely alone in the building for 8 hours. Since there were so few customers, my job duties varied from running the cash register to simply restocking the shelves. We had an electronic beeper at the front entrance that would go off whenever a customer walked through the door. This system was incredibly helpful because it alerted me while I was working in the back aisles so I would know exactly when to head back to the front register. A few hours into my shift on this particular night, I walked back to the front counter to check my phone, which I had left charging near the register. When I picked it up, I noticed a new voicemail notification from an unknown number. I opened the message and listened to it, but the audio was incredibly strange. It was a highly distorted, muffled voice, and I could not even tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. The sound quality was so bad that I could not understand a single word, and the automated transcription on my phone was completely blank. I figured it was just some random spam call and decided to ignore it. Everyone gets weird calls like that from time to time, so I put my phone back down on the counter and went back to stocking shelves in the middle of the store. But as I was working, my phone started vibrating repeatedly in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a rapid succession of text messages from the same unknown number. The first message said to call back when you can. The second message read, "I know you are at work and I am coming to visit." The third one asked, "What time are you working until?" I had no idea who this could be, and it was starting to make me feel very uneasy. I texted back and immediately asked, "Who the hell is this?" I saw the typing bubble pop up for about 20 seconds, but then it vanished without a reply. I was definitely unnerved, but I had to finish my work, so I pushed the fear aside and kept stalking. Eventually, the front door beeper went off, alerting me that someone had entered. I walked back to the front register and waited, but I did not see anyone walking around the aisles. I stood there for a long time, scanning the empty store, but it was completely quiet. I assumed it was just a glitch or a draft of wind, so I went back to stocking. At around 2 a.m., I brought a new cart of beauty products to the second aisle. As I did, I noticed a woman standing in the corner of the very next aisle, looking down at the bottom shelf. I stepped into her aisle and asked if she needed help finding anything, but she completely ignored me. She did not look up or acknowledge me at all. It felt incredibly awkward, so I decided to leave her alone and walked back to the front register. That was when my phone started vibrating again. The unknown number was spamming me with a series of nonsensical messages. Then, one message arrived that made my heart stop. It simply said, "I am here." I decided I had had enough of this game, so I called the number back. Instantly, I heard a phone ringing from inside the store, right from the beauty aisle. My heart started beating incredibly fast, and my throat went tight. I ended the call, and the ringing in the aisle stopped immediately. I ran back to the safety of the front counter. I did not want to call the police over a prank, so I called my best friend instead. He picked up immediately, and I asked him if he knew any brunette girls who had my number and would pull a sick stunt like this. He guessed a few names, but none of them matched her body shape. My friend told me I was being paranoid, and that I should just go talk to her. I hung up and prepared to walk back over there. But as I looked up, I saw her head slowly peer around the corner of the beauty aisle. She was kneeling on the floor because the shelf was low. The first thing I saw was bright red blood trickling down her cheeks. She was smiling a wide manic smile and making a quiet, choked-up laughing sound. She had deliberately cut her cheeks right next to her lips. I suddenly recognized her face. She was a woman in her late 30s, with severe mental health issues who had harassed me on Instagram before using fake accounts. As far as I knew, she was supposed to be in a psychiatric hospital because she was considered dangerous. She must have gotten my number from my public social media profile. Seeing her bloody, smiling face made me want to throw up. I yelled at her to get away or I would stab her, which was a total bluff. I ran to the back of the store and hid in a small hallway. I only breathed a sigh of relief when I finally heard the front door chime go off, signaling she had left. I checked the store to make sure she was gone and called the police. They took a report, watched the camera footage, and promised to patrol the area. I blocked her number, and I can only hope her family or doctors found her. I used to work the dairy section of a grocery store, and it was the worst job I ever had. The work was physically exhausting, requiring constant heavy lifting of heavy milk crates, dealing with disgusting expired products, and shivering in the freezing cold. The main dairy cooler was a massive walk-in refrigerator located in the back warehouse area of the store where all the extra stock was kept. Because the cooler was so large and hidden from the main sales floor, I would often go in there just to hide and relax. The supervisors on duty never thought to look for me inside the freezer. I always made sure to bring a thick black hoodie to work just so I would not freeze while I was avoiding my duties. One night, I was scheduled to work until 10 p.m. The store usually got very quiet after 9, but a strict supervisor named Mr. Senko was on duty, and he was an absolute pain to deal with. He was constantly checking up on the employees, so after stocking the milk cartons one last time, I wheeled my empty cart back to the warehouse area. I wanted to slip into the dairy cooler to hide out for the last hour of my shift. As I walked toward the heavy insulated doors, I glanced through the glass window. For a fraction of a second, I saw a pale human face looking back at me from the dark interior. But as soon as I blinked, the face ducked down and completely vanished from my view. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, immediately greeted by a blast of freezing air and the roaring sound of the massive refrigeration fans. Stacks of wooden pallets, plastic milk crates, and cardboard boxes were piled high all around the room. I looked around carefully, but I could not see anyone. There were plenty of hiding spots behind the giant columns of inventory, but the space seemed empty. I walked to my usual spot, sat down on an empty crate hidden behind a large stack of boxes, and pulled my hood up to stay warm. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the cooler shut off, plunging the room into near total darkness. The only light came from the warehouse outside, filtering through the glass window of the doors. My heart jumped into my throat. I immediately assumed that Mr. Senko had figured out I was hiding in there and had shut off the lights to make me come out. I stood up and stepped out from behind the boxes to head for the exit, but as I walked toward the doors, I froze in absolute terror. Standing directly in front of the two cooler doors, blocking my exit, was the silhouette of an incredibly tall person. This could not be Mr. Senko because he was a very short man, and this figure was at least a foot taller than me. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered back on. The figure was completely gone, and the space in front of the doors was empty. I walked over and waved my hand through the air, feeling an icy, overwhelming presence. I bolted through the double doors, slammed them shut, and turned off the light. I checked through the window, but the dark room was empty. I threw my apron on the floor, clocked out early, and ran to my car. I did not care if I got fired, I just needed to get out of there. I do overnight stock shifts for various local Lowe's home improvement stores. My job is highly mobile, and I simply go to whichever specific location needs me for the night. This usually depends on which store is receiving the largest shipment of inventory. My duties include unloading massive delivery trucks, operating heavy forklifts through the warehouse and sales floor, and stocking the shelves before the stores open to the public. On one quiet night, the only other person in the entire store with me was a truck driver named Paul. Once we finished successfully unloading his truck, he helped me sort the heavy packages in the back receiving room. After that, he said goodbye and drove off to make another pickup, leaving me completely alone in the massive, quiet building. I went about my normal routine, scanning new shipments with my handheld inventory gun, and driving the forklift to transport the items out to the main retail floor to stock the empty shelves. I was scanning items in the back when a loud crash made me jump. A large box had fallen from a high stack of pallets. The box was still sealed, so nothing spilled, but as I got closer, I noticed a very strange foul odor in the air. I dismissed it, got the forklift to put the box back, and continued my work. Later, I turned into the paint aisle and saw someone dressed in dark clothing walking at the other end. No one else was supposed to be in the store, and they had no uniform. I yelled at them, and they immediately sprinted down a side aisle. I chased after them, but they disappeared. I returned to the warehouse, and another loud crash came from the exact same pile of pallets. I grabbed a tall ladder and climbed up to inspect the stack. At the top of the boxes, I discovered a hidden space enclosed by a wall of packages. Crouching inside this cardboard nest was a disheveled man dressed in all black. He was the source of the foul smell. He stared at me and then stood up, lunging in my direction. I quickly scrambled down the ladder, jumped to the floor, and ran to call the police. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but the man had fled. When management checked the security cameras, they discovered he had been living in that secret box fortress for an entire week. He only came down at night to steal food and water, remaining completely unnoticed right above the staff. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When we think of a security guard working the graveyard shift, we usually picture someone sitting at a desk, looking at monitors, maybe drinking a cup of coffee to stay awake, and fighting off boredom. For the most part, that is exactly what the job is. It is hours of absolutely nothing happening. But every now and then, the quiet of the night is shattered by something completely unexpected. When you are the only person in a massive dark building, you are incredibly vulnerable. Today, we are going to look at 3 real-life accounts from security guards who went to work, expecting another boring night, only to find themselves running for their lives from something waiting for them in the dark. Our first story comes from a security guard who had been working for his security company for about 6 years. Because he had been there so long, he had a high level of seniority over the other guards. He had undergone a lot of advanced training, and he had multiple credentials under his belt. This meant he got first pick of his shifts. He usually chose to work mornings or evenings, and he always kept his weekends free. But then, his company picked up a brand new contract. It was for a massive 6-story government office building. The location of this building was incredibly strange. It was sitting right in the middle of nowhere. To get to it, you had to turn off the main highway, drive onto a local road, and then turn onto a narrow side road. You had to travel about 3 miles down this side road to find the property. The building was surrounded by a massive asphalt parking lot. Around the entire parking lot was a 10-foot tall metal fence topped with sharp barbed wire. There was only one way in and one way out right at the front gate. Beyond that fence, there was nothing but dense black woods for miles in every direction. No houses, no shops, no other buildings, just complete isolation. After a few months of managing this new building, the security company ran into a major problem. They could not keep guards on the overnight shifts. During the day, they had 3 guards on duty. On weekday nights, they had 2. But on the weekend nights, from Friday to Sunday, they only had 1 single guard on duty. Every guard on every shift was fully armed with a service weapon. Still, the isolation was too much for most people, and guards kept quitting. Because of this, the supervisor approached our protagonist. He asked him if he would be willing to work some overtime on the weekend overnight shifts until they could hire and train new people. At first, he wanted to say no, but he was planning to move into a new apartment soon, and he really needed the extra money for his security deposit, so he agreed to do it. The first 2 weeks went by without any issues. It was quiet, boring, and predictable. But on the 3rd weekend, everything changed. It was a Saturday night around 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside, a massive, violent thunderstorm was raging. The wind was howling, and heavy rain was pelting against the windows. Our guard was sitting up on the 6th floor in the camera control room. This room had a window that looked out over the back parking lot. Inside the room, there were 3 large computer monitors displaying live closed-circuit television feeds from all over the building and the parking lot. To pass the time, he had the lights turned off. He was watching movies he had downloaded on his phone and playing games on his Game Boy. He was playing Tetris, trying to beat his old high score. After sitting for several hours, his body started to feel stiff. He stood up to stretch his legs and walk around the small room. He was also starting to feel incredibly sleepy. He decided he would walk down the hallway to the vending machines to grab an energy drink to help power through the rest of his shift. Before leaving the room, he walked over to the window. He parted the blinds with his fingers and looked outside into the stormy night. The wind was whipping branches and debris across the wet pavement. Suddenly, a massive flash of lightning illuminated the entire area beyond the fence. In that brief second of bright light, he saw something. A dark figure darted from one tree to another. The distance between the trees was about 20 feet. The figure moved with incredible speed. He froze. He kept his eyes glued to that exact spot, waiting for another flash of lightning. He wanted to know if his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. A few seconds later, lightning flashed again, but this time, there was nothing there. The space around the trees was empty. He let out a breath and shook his head. He figured he was just exhausted and seeing things. He let go of the blinds, left the control room, and walked down the long, empty hallway to the vending machine. The hallway was lined with polished tiles, and his boots made soft squeaking sounds against the floor. He arrived at the vending machine, inserted some coins, and purchased a cold energy drink. He pulled the silver tab and drank the entire thing right there. He wanted the caffeine to hit his system as fast as possible. The walk back to the control room took him only about 5 minutes, but when he stepped back inside, he immediately noticed something wrong. One of the camera feeds on the monitors was completely black. It was the feed for the camera covering the back parking lot, the exact area he had just been looking at. He walked back to the window, opened the blinds and peered out. He looked toward the post where the camera was mounted. He saw the camera dangling by its wires, blowing violently in the wind. He figured the heavy storm must have finally broken the mount. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and typed up a maintenance report about the broken camera. He was just about to go back to his movie when a loud, sharp alert sound echoed through the room. It was the security system. This alert only went off when someone was attempting to access a secure area of the building that required a numeric code on a keypad. He quickly pulled up the access log on his main screen. His heart stopped. The keypad being accessed was the one at the back door, right by the back parking lot where the camera had just been broken. And then the log updated. The system showed a green light. Whoever was out there had successfully entered the correct security code. They were now inside the building. The guard felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew it could not be a regular employee. If a worker was scheduled to be in the building after hours, security would have received a written memo detailing their name, their arrival time, and which floors they would be on. He also knew it was not another guard, because he was the only one scheduled. He reached for the desk phone to call the police. He picked up the receiver and put it to his ear. There was no dial tone. The line was completely dead. He pulled out his personal cell phone. He looked at the screen. There was no service. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers, or the building was simply blocking the signal. He realized his best option was to walk down the hallway to see if he could find a spot with a signal. He stepped out of the control room into the dimly lit hallway. He walked slowly, staring at his phone screen, hoping to see even a single bar of service appear. He was heading toward the service stairwell. Suddenly, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. The entire building was plunged into pitch-black darkness. The power was gone. Panic began to set in. He knew the building had a backup generator, but it had not kicked on. This meant someone had manually shut off the power. He was very close to the stairwell doors. He decided his best bet was to run down the stairs, get to the lobby, run out to his truck, and drive away to get help. He opened the heavy metal door to the stairwell. It was absolutely pitch black inside. He knew that if the intruder had cut the power, they had to be down in the basement where the generator room was located. The basement was just one level below the ground floor lobby. The stairwell he was in led directly down there. He decided to use the darkness to his advantage. He stepped into the stairwell and began to descend the steps as quietly as possible. He made it down to the 4th floor. Suddenly, the loud creak of a heavy door opening echoed from the very bottom of the stairwell. The guard stopped dead in his tracks. He held his breath. He knew he was armed with his service weapon. He had gone through extensive training, but as he stood there in the dark, he realized he had never actually shot anyone in his life, and he was terrified of having to do so. He prayed it would not come to that. Then he heard it. The heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps beginning to walk up the concrete steps. He knew he could not keep going down. He had to change his plan immediately. He decided to turn around and walk as quickly and quietly as possible back up to the 6th floor. Right above the 6th floor landing, there was a metal ladder attached to the wall. This ladder led to an overhead hatch that went out onto the roof. He figured he could climb up that ladder, hide in the darkness near the top, and wait out the danger. He turned around to start climbing back up, but as he turned, his holstered gun swung outward. It hit the metal handrail of the stairs with a loud metallic clang. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet stairwell. The guard froze. Down below, the heavy footsteps stopped instantly. For a few agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the footsteps downstairs erupted into a full sprint. Whoever it was charging up the stairs toward him. The guard did not hesitate. He bolted up the stairs as fast as his legs could carry him, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the 6th floor landing. He knew the intruder was closing the gap. He needed to buy himself some time. He grabbed the handle of the 6th floor stairwell door. He pulled it open violently and let it slam shut with a massive bang. He hoped the loud sound would trick the intruder into thinking he had run out into the 6th-floor hallway. Immediately after slamming the door, he ran to the ladder, grabbed the metal rungs, and climbed up into the darkness as fast as he could. Just seconds later, the intruder burst onto the 6th-floor landing. The man was breathing heavily. He saw the door that had just slammed. Without looking up toward the ladder, the man pushed the door open and ran out into the 6th-floor hallway. The heavy door swung closed behind him. The guard knew this was his only chance. He was about 10 feet up the ladder. He did not waste time climbing back down. He simply let go and leaped. He landed on the concrete landing with a loud, heavy thud. It hurt, but the adrenaline washed the pain away. He turned and threw himself down the stairs, running downward as fast as he possibly could. The intruder must have heard the thud of his landing. The guard had barely made it down one flight of stairs when he heard the 6th-floor door fly open again. The heavy footsteps of the intruder began pounding down the stairs behind him. It was a terrifying, high-stakes chase. Both of them were sprinting down the concrete steps in the dark. The guard managed to stay exactly one floor ahead of his pursuer. As the guard reached the ground floor lobby, he heard a sudden, loud crashing noise from the stairwell above him. It was followed by a sharp cry of pain. It sounded like the intruder had tripped and fallen down a flight of steps. The guard did not stop to check. He burst through the stairwell door into the lobby. He ran to the front exit and used his keys to unlock the door. He shoved it open and ran out into the pouring rain. His truck was parked close to the entrance. He pulled out his key fob, pressed the button to start the engine and unlock the doors, and sprinted across the wet parking lot. He jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors behind him. He threw the truck into reverse. Just as he did, he looked toward the building entrance. Through the heavy rain, he saw a man burst out of the building. The man was dressed entirely in black, wearing a hood and a mask that covered his face. He was sprinting directly toward the truck. The guard slammed the gear shifter into drive and floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched on the wet asphalt as the truck tore out of the parking lot. He drove through the open gate and sped down the dark side road. He drove for about 3 miles. As he neared the main road, he looked at his phone. He finally had a signal. He immediately called the police and explained what had happened. The police met him on the main road about 15 minutes later. The guard followed their patrol cars back to the building. Together, they searched the entire 6-story structure and the surrounding woods, but they found no sign of the masked man. However, when the police searched the stairwell where the guard had heard the crash, they made a chilling discovery. Lying on the concrete step was a fully loaded, unregistered semi-automatic handgun. The intruder had dropped it when he fell. To this day, the guard has no idea who that man was, how he got the secret keypad code, or why he was trying to break into that isolated building. He is just incredibly thankful that luck was on his side that night, and that he made it out alive. The guard later found out from his supervisor that the code used to gain access to the back door belonged to an employee who had been laid off several months prior. The company had neglected to update the keypad codes after the layoffs, which was a massive security oversight. This meant that the intruder was likely a former employee, or someone who had managed to get the code from an ex-employee. But the identity of the masked man remains a mystery. The police ran ballistics and fingerprint checks on the unregistered handgun, but the gun was clean. There were no prints on the frame, the magazine, or the ammunition. It was as if the gun had been wiped down completely before the break-in. The guard realized that if he had not created that diversion with the slamming door, or if he had tripped instead of the intruder, things could have ended in a tragedy. He could have been shot in that pitch-black stairwell, with no one around to help him for hours. Our second story takes us to New Jersey, where another security guard worked the night shift in a medium-sized corporate office building. For the most part, his job was incredibly boring. The nights were quiet and completely uneventful. His main duties were to monitor the security screens, conduct a few patrol rounds, log any minor incidents, and wait for the morning shift to arrive. But one night, around midnight, everything changed. The last of the employees had left the building. The main lobby was completely empty, save for the guard sitting behind his desk. The only light came from the blue glow of his security monitors. He was scanning the different camera feeds, looking at the elevators, the quiet hallways, and the underground parking garage. Suddenly, something caught his eye on the lower garage feed. He saw a figure moving slowly between the parked cars. This immediately put him on high alert. The underground garage was secured. At this hour, the lot should have been completely empty. Only employees with 24-hour access could get in, and the guard knew that no one with that level of clearance was scheduled to be there that night. At first, he tried to rationalize it. He thought maybe it was a late-night IT worker or a member of the cleaning crew, but the details did not fit. The cleaning crew had finished their work and left hours ago, and the figure on the screen was not carrying any equipment, nor was he wearing any kind of uniform. Instead, the man was wearing a long dark coat that looked far too big for him. He was not walking toward any specific car or toward the exit. He was just weaving slowly between the rows of vehicles, pausing to look around. The way he moved was deeply unsettling. He seemed to be inspecting the area, making sure he was alone. The guard felt a knot form in his stomach. He picked up his radio and called his supervisor to report what he was seeing. The supervisor told him to stay at his desk, keep his eyes on the monitors, and wait. But the guard had a bad feeling. He felt that he needed to investigate the situation in person. He grabbed his heavy flashlight, stepped away from his desk, and walked to the elevator. The ride down to the garage felt agonizingly long. Every time the elevator passed a floor, the mechanical hum echoed loudly in the empty shaft, making him feel increasingly nervous. When the elevator doors finally opened on the garage level, the guard stepped out into the chilly air. He clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam across the rows of cars. The garage was dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy against your ears, where even the tiniest sound feels incredibly loud. He walked forward and called out, stating that he was security and asking if anyone was there. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, but there was no reply. He walked slowly down the rows of parked cars, shining his light into the dark spaces between the vehicles and into the far corners of the garage. He checked everywhere, but there was absolutely no one there. The garage was completely empty. He began to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned, or maybe a trick of the light had made a shadow look like a person. Feeling a bit foolish, he got back into the elevator and returned to the lobby. He sat down at his desk and looked back at the security monitors. His stomach dropped. The man in the long dark coat was standing on the screen, in the exact same spot where he had been before. The guard felt a wave of cold terror wash over him. He had just been standing in that exact spot moments ago. There was no way the man could have returned there without the guard seeing him, unless the man had been hiding, watching him, and waiting for him to leave. He radioed his supervisor again, his voice shaking. The supervisor told him to stay put and not to approach the intruder under any circumstances. For the next 20 minutes, the guard sat frozen at his desk, his eyes glued to the screen. He watched the man in the long coat begin to move. The man walked slowly toward the heavy door that led to the stairwell of the upper floors. He moved with caution, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if checking to see if he was being followed. Then the man pushed the stairwell door open and disappeared from the camera feed. The guard quickly switched through the other camera channels. He checked the hallways, the elevator lobbies, and even the rooftop access. But the man was nowhere to be found. He had vanished completely. This only made the guard feel worse. It was impossible for someone to move through the building that quickly without appearing on any other cameras, unless they knew exactly where the blind spots were. As he sat there, his heart pounding, he heard the distinct chime of the elevator. The doors slid open into the empty lobby. No one was inside. But as the guard looked closer, he saw something on the polished floor. There was a trail of wet footprints leading out of the elevator cab and across the lobby. They were bare footprints. The realization was horrifying. It was freezing cold outside. Whoever this man was, he had taken his shoes off and was now walking through the building completely barefoot. The footprints were slightly muddy, leaving dark outlines on the clean marble. He knelt down to touch one of them. It was still wet. The water had not even begun to evaporate yet. The guard knew he should lock himself in the security office, but some instinct told him he needed to find out where this person was. He called the off-site patrol service for backup and decided to do one quick sweep of the upper floors. In hindsight, he knew this was a terrible mistake. He took the elevator to the 5th floor. He stepped out into the dark hallway. holding his flashlight. He checked each office door as he walked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every creak of the building made him flinch. Halfway down the hall, he noticed one of the office doors was slightly open. This was highly unusual, as all office doors were supposed to be locked at night. He pushed the door open with his flashlight and looked inside. The room was empty. The only light came from the glowing screen of a computer monitor that had been left on. The chair was pushed neatly under the desk. Nothing seemed out of place. He stepped back out into the hallway. That was when he heard it. The sound of footsteps on the tile floor behind him. They were wet, heavy, and uneven footsteps, and they were moving fast. He heard a squelching sound, followed by a heavy drag of a foot. It sounded like someone was limping or walking with great difficulty. The guard spun around, swinging his flashlight beam down the long corridor. The light caught a brief glimpse of the dark, oversized coat at the far end of the hallway. The man was not running, but he was walking with an intense, terrifying speed, heading straight for him. The guard realized with absolute horror that the man had been following him the entire time, hiding in the shadows just out of sight. He turned and ran. He sprinted down the hall as fast as he could, heading for the stairwell. His arms slammed hard against the handrail as he threw himself through the heavy door. Behind him, he could hear the wet footsteps pounding on the floor, echoing loudly in the stairwell. The panic was suffocating. He had no idea what this man wanted, or how he had entered the building. He ran down several flights of stairs and slammed another heavy door behind him. He collapsed onto the steps, shaking violently, trying to quiet his heavy breathing. He listened closely, but the footsteps above him had stopped. He sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, until the off-site patrol backup finally arrived. When the patrol officers walked in, they found the guard pale, sweating, and trembling. They searched the entire building from top to bottom. They checked every floor, every office, and the underground garage, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of the man in the long coat. There were no wet footprints. It was as if he had never existed. The most unsettling part came when they went to review the security camera footage. The recording from the exact time the intruder had appeared in the garage was gone. The system had suffered a glitch, leaving a massive gap in the feed. The corporate building in New Jersey also underwent a thorough investigation. The guard's supervisor initially suspected that the guard might have been hallucinating due to sleep deprivation. But the wet, muddy, bare footprints in the lobby were proof that someone had indeed been inside. When the technical team examined the security system to find out why the garage camera footage had been corrupted, they discovered something even more disturbing. The wires in the server room had been physically manipulated. Someone had bypassed the local storage unit for that specific camera, meaning the footage was not just corrupted by a glitch. It had been intentionally deleted from the system while the intruder was still inside. This suggested that the barefoot man was not just some random vagrant seeking shelter from the cold. He knew exactly how the building's security infrastructure worked. He knew where the servers were kept, and he knew how to disable the recordings. The thought that a highly organized stalker was wandering barefoot through the corridors, hiding in empty offices, and deleting evidence in real time was enough to make anyone quit their job. The guard quit his job within a month. The fear was too much to handle. He could no longer stand walking those empty hallways alone at night, constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if those wet, bare footsteps were waiting for him in the dark. Even years later, he cannot enter an underground parking garage or an empty office building without feeling a wave of intense anxiety. Our third and final story took place just a few days ago in Mississauga, a city just outside of Toronto. It was the very first night of training for a young man who had just hired on as a mobile security guard. To understand this story, you have to know what a mobile security guard does. Unlike static guards who stay at one building, a mobile guard drives a marked patrol vehicle to various client sites throughout the night, performing quick perimeter checks, writing reports, and responding to alarms. On this night, the young trainee was riding along with his supervisor. The supervisor was a friendly guy, only a few years older than him. He was showing the trainee the ropes, teaching him how to conduct patrols, how to write official reports, and how to operate the various alarm systems. Usually, they would only respond to a building if dispatch radioed them about a triggered alarm. But on this night, they were scheduled to perform a routine perimeter check at a pharmacy and medical clinic. There was no alarm. They arrived at the clinic at around 1:15 in the morning. As they pulled into the parking lot, they immediately noticed that something was terribly wrong. First, the heavy overhead door to the underground parking garage had been left wide open. Second, as they walked up to the main entrance of the clinic, they saw that the front glass door had been violently smashed open. Shards of glass littered the ground, glittering in the headlights of their patrol car. The supervisor stopped in his tracks. He was shocked. He muttered to himself, wondering how this was possible. If someone had broken in, the main alarm system should have been blaring. According to the supervisor, this clinic was a brand new contract for their security company. The trainee felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had no idea what to do. This was his very first night on the job. They stepped cautiously through the broken front door into the dark building. The supervisor suddenly grabbed the trainee's arm and pointed toward the elevator lobby. "Look at the elevator," the supervisor whispered. The trainee looked. The digital display above the elevator doors showed the elevator car was active. It was moving. It went from the ground floor to the first floor, then the second, then the third, and finally it stopped at the fourth floor, which was the very top of the building. The supervisor nodded grimly. He reached down and pulled his expandable metal baton from his belt. The trainee felt sick. His heart was hammering, and his breathing became shallow and heavy. In that moment, he absolutely hated his new job and wished he was anywhere else. But they had to investigate. They walked over to the elevator, pressed the call button, and got inside. As the elevator climbed toward the fourth floor, the tension in the small metal box was thick. The trainee was terrified of what would happen when the doors opened. What if someone was waiting for them with a weapon? What if they were immediately attacked? The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. Fortunately, the hallway in front of them was empty, but it was incredibly dark. They stepped out and turned on the hallway lights. The supervisor told the trainee to stay close to him. He warned him to be ready to defend himself if they ran into anyone. They began searching the offices and rooms on the fourth floor, but they found no one. Just as they were standing near the center of the hallway, a sound echoed through the quiet building. It was the distinct sound of footsteps coming from the concrete stairwell, moving downward. The supervisor and the trainee rushed toward the stairwell door. They were about to open it and pursue the intruder. But as they reached the door, the footsteps suddenly stopped. The building fell into a heavy, dead silence. They could hear nothing but the sound of their own rapid breathing. The supervisor realized they were in a highly dangerous situation. He pulled out his radio and contacted dispatch. He reported that they needed immediate police backup. He explained that someone was inside the building with them, hiding in the stairwell below, and that they might be armed and waiting to ambush them if they went down. Dispatch told them to stay exactly where they were, to not attempt to approach the suspect, and promised that backup was on the way. Hearing his supervisor panic only made the trainee feel worse. The supervisor was supposed to be the leader, the one in control. If he was scared, then the situation was truly dire. The trainee tried to calm him down, calling him bro instead of sir, telling him that everything would be okay and that backup would arrive soon. You might wonder why they did not just run for the exit. The problem was that the intruder was somewhere in the stairwell below them, which meant he had access to the ground floor exit. If they took the elevator down, the noise of the machinery would alert him, and he could easily block their path when the doors opened. If they took the stairs, they would walk directly into him. They were trapped on the top floor. After 15 agonizing minutes, they finally heard the heavy front door open on the ground floor. A loud voice echoed up the stairs, announcing that it was security. It was their senior supervisor. The trainee's supervisor radioed back, warning him to be extremely careful because there was an intruder hiding downstairs. The senior supervisor made his way up to the fourth floor and joined them. He told them they were going to search the building together. They descended the stairs, checking every single room, office, and restroom on each floor. But as they searched, they found no one. While they were on the third floor, scanning a dark office, a sudden noise echoed from the lobby below. It was the sound of the front door being shoved open, followed by the rapid, frantic sound of someone running out into the night. They sprinted down to the ground floor, but by the time they reached the exit, the person was gone. The parking lot was empty. Both guards were left in a state of shock. They had searched the building thoroughly and found no one. This meant the intruder must have had an incredibly clever hiding spot that they had completely overlooked, or the building had some secret exit they did not know about. Perhaps they had hidden inside a drop ceiling or a utility closet, waiting for the guards to pass before making their run. The training incident in Mississauga left the young trainee questioning his career path. When he discussed the event with his family, they urged him to find another job. But he needed the work, so he stayed. He spent his subsequent shifts scanning the dark corners of the pharmacy clinic, always expecting to see the elevator indicators start moving on their own. The security company eventually installed extra cameras and updated the clinic's alarm system, but they never discovered who had broken into the building or why they were operating the elevator. Some of the older guards joked that the clinic was haunted by a former patient, but the trainee knew that the footsteps he had heard in the stairwell were too heavy, too real, and too calculated to be anything other than a living, breathing person who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike. The trainee was deeply shaken by the experience. It was the most terrifying night of his life, and it happened on his very first shift. Despite the horror, he had to return to that same clinic the following weekend, but this time, he would be working the shift entirely alone. The job of a security guard is often seen as easy, but these stories show us how quickly things can change. When you are alone in a large building at night, you are the only line of defense between safety and whatever is hiding in the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine you are doing a favor for your family, expecting a quiet and peaceful weekend, only to find yourself trapped in a real-life nightmare. It was a warm summer weekend when a young man decided to watch over his grandmother's house. She was 75 years old, and she had planned a wonderful trip to Florida with a group of her close friends from church. Since she was going to be gone for several days, she did not want her home sitting completely empty, so she asked her grandson if he would mind staying there. He happily agreed. He packed up a small bag of clothes and drove over to her house, ready for a relaxing weekend of watching television and sleeping in. When he arrived, the house felt comforting and familiar. He decided to sleep in the guest bedroom, which was located right next to his grandmother's master bedroom. This guest bedroom had 2 twin beds inside of it, and it brought back a lot of old memories. When he and his brother were younger, they would always sleep in these exact twin beds whenever they had sleepovers at their grandmother's house. For nostalgic reasons, he chose the bed right next to the window. But before he got into bed for the night, he decided to do a quick sweep of the house. He walked through the quiet hallways, checking the front door, the back door, and all the window locks to make sure everything was completely secure. Once he was satisfied that the house was locked up tight, he finally climbed into bed. It was still relatively early, and he was not feeling very tired yet, so he lay there on his phone. He spent about an hour or two scrolling through social media, watching videos, and texting his friends. The house was dead silent, save for the occasional creaks of the old wood. But then, right around midnight, the silence was broken. He thought he could hear a faint, distant sound coming from outside. He paused his video and listened closely. It sounded like a human voice. It was a woman's voice, and she was softly saying the word, "Hello." He froze in bed, his heart rate starting to speed up. He slowly slipped out of the covers and opened the guest bedroom door. He began to inch his way down the dark hallway, moving as quietly as possible so he could hear where the sound was coming from. The voice was repeating itself. Every 10 seconds or so, a woman's voice would drift through the air, saying hello. As he approached the front door, he realized the sound was coming from right outside the entryway. The problem was that his grandmother's heavy wooden front door did not have a peephole. He could not see who was standing on the porch without opening the door, which he absolutely did not want to do. However, he remembered that the dining room windows offered a clear view of the front porch. He walked over to the dining room, trying to make absolutely no sound on the hardwood floors. He reached the window and tried to peek his head in between plastic blinds, without making it obvious that he was looking. But he did a poor job of being stealthy. When he looked through the small gap in the blinds, his eyes locked onto a woman standing on the front porch. She was staring directly at the window, right back at him, as if she knew exactly where he would be looking. She had a strained, freakish smile stretched across her face, and she said, "Hello!" Once again, the woman was older, maybe in her late 50s or early 60s, but she did not look like an innocent, sweet grandmother. There was something deeply unsettling about her face that completely skeeved him out. He quickly stepped away from the window, his mind racing. He wondered if this could be one of his grandmother's friends from church who did not know she was in Florida. But that made no sense. It was midnight. Why would anyone show up at this hour? And why was she not knocking on the door or ringing the doorbell? Instead, she was just standing there on the dark porch, smiling and repeating the word hello. Deeply unsettled, he decided to go back to the guest bedroom. He shut the door tightly, hoping that if he ignored her, she would eventually walk away. With the bedroom door shut, he could no longer hear her voice. He sat on the bed and began texting his sisters and his friends, telling them about the bizarre and creepy situation he was dealing with. After a while, the silence returned, and he slowly began to calm down. His sisters texted him back, telling him that he should call their grandmother to ask if she knew who this woman might be. But he knew there was no way his grandmother would be awake at this hour, and she rarely checked her cell phone anyway, so he decided against it. Just as he was starting to feel safe again, a sudden violent noise shattered the quiet night. It was a loud, aggressive banging sound coming from the guest bedroom window. It was not a gentle knock or a polite tap. Someone was slamming their hands against the glass. He felt a sharp, fierce pain in his chest as his body instantly went into a full fight-or-flight response. The banging stopped, and then, from just outside the thin window pane, he heard that same familiar voice say, "Hello." Fueled by a sudden rush of adrenaline, he felt a burst of confidence. He marched over to the window, grabbed the plastic blinds, and shoved them upward. He found himself face to face with the terrifying older woman. There was only a thin pane of glass separating them. He stared at her gross, smiling face, and screamed that he was calling the cops. He pulled the blinds back down, ran out of the room, and bolted up the stairs to the second floor. He decided to lock himself in the upstairs guest bedroom, hiding under the covers. He did not actually call the police, as he hoped she would just leave if he stayed hidden. A few hours later, he finally gathered the courage to go downstairs and peer out the windows. The woman was finally gone. The next morning, he called his grandmother and told her everything that had happened. The moment he finished speaking, his grandmother began to panic and yell into the phone. She was clearly distressed. She explained that just a few days before she left for Florida, she was at the local grocery store when she realized she was being watched. A woman who looked about 10 years younger than her had followed her through the aisles, staring and smiling at her for absolutely no reason. He tried to calm his grandmother down, not knowing if the two events were truly connected, but it gave him chills. His grandmother was 75 and sometimes lost her wits, but the pure terror in her voice made him believe that the strange smiling woman had actually targeted her home. Now, let us fast forward to another unsettling encounter, this one involving a college student named Nicholas. Nicholas was a young freshman studying at Syracuse University. If you know anything about the area around Syracuse, you know that it is not always the safest place, especially when you wander off campus at night. Nicholas had recently gone through a painful breakup with his first serious girlfriend, and after spending some time recovering, he decided it was time to get back into the dating scene. He decided to download the dating app Hinge to see if he could meet anyone interesting. It did not take long before he matched with a blonde girl named Stephanie. As they began texting back and forth, Nicholas felt a genuine connection. She also went to Syracuse University, and they had a surprising amount of things in common. They both loved to read, they enjoyed going to the movies, and they shared the exact same dry sense of humor. After a few days of constant messaging, Nicholas suggested that they should go on a movie date together. Stephanie replied that she would love to go. However, instead of meeting at the theater, she told him to meet her at a specific spot just off campus, and she would pick him up in her car. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Nicholas walked to the designated corner of a quiet residential neighborhood block. He stood under the dim glow of a streetlight, waiting for Stephanie to arrive. While he was waiting, he received a message from her, asking him to share his live location with her so she could see exactly where he was standing. Without thinking much of it, he clicked the share button and sent his location. A few minutes later, he saw a car turn down the street and begin slowly driving toward him. The car pulled up to the curb and came to a stop right in front of him. But when the driver rolled down the window, Nicholas realized something was very wrong. The person behind the wheel was not a young blonde college girl. It was a random, middle-aged man. The man looked out at Nicholas and asked him what he was doing, standing all alone on the street corner at night. Nicholas felt a wave of confusion and suspicion, but he calmly replied that he was waiting for someone. The man then asked him if he was waiting for Stephanie. Nicholas was taken aback. He asked how the man could possibly know that. The man smiled and claimed that he was actually Stephanie's father. He told Nicholas to hop into the passenger seat so he could drive him to meet up with her. Nicholas took a close look at the man's face. He looked far too old to be Stephanie's father, and the entire situation felt incredibly sketchy. Nicholas was no idiot, and he knew that getting into a stranger's car on a dark street was a recipe for disaster. In a firm, confident voice, Nicholas asked the man why Stephanie had not mentioned that her father would be the one picking him up. The man quickly claimed that he did not trust random guys meeting up with his daughter, and he simply wanted to meet Nicholas first to make sure he was safe. Nicholas stared at the man for a brief moment, decided he was not going to take any chances, and simply turned around and walked away in the opposite direction. The man in the car seemed completely surprised by this. He began yelling after Nicholas, telling him to come back, but Nicholas kept walking. He heard the car's engine rev behind him, and he glanced over his shoulder to make sure the man was not spinning the car around to follow him. To his relief, the car continued straight down the street, turned left, and disappeared from sight. Nicholas breathed a sigh of relief and continued his walk back toward the safety of the campus. He reached the corner of the block and was about to make a turn when he noticed a car parked on the side of the road with its headlights turned completely off. As he walked past it, he realized it was the exact same car the older man had been driving. The windows were heavily tinted, making it impossible to see who was sitting inside. Nicholas tried his best to act natural and not show that he was suspicious, keeping his eyes forward as he kept walking. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from the person claiming to be Stephanie. The text asked why he had not gotten into the car with her dad. Nicholas decided to completely ignore the message. He kept walking, occasionally looking back to see if the dark car was moving. When he reached a major intersection, he turned the corner and immediately began sprinting as fast as he could toward the campus. He finally made it back to the university grounds, completely out of breath. He began walking toward his dorm building, trying to calm his racing heart. But as he walked down a quieter path, he felt like he could hear the sound of footsteps behind him. He tried to convince himself that he was just being paranoid after what had happened. But then, he heard the distinct sound of a shoe kicking a piece of broken glass on the pavement. He knew for an absolute fact that he was being followed. He quickly ducked behind a parked van, crouched down and listened. He heard the footsteps getting closer, coming from between the parked cars across from him. He suddenly realized a terrifying mistake he had made. He had never stopped sharing his live location with the Stephanie profile. The person on the other end of the app knew his exact coordinates, tracking his movements in real time. Looking out from behind the van, he saw the older man approaching. The man yelled out to him, saying that he should come back and that he would take him to see Stephanie. Nicholas knew there was no way a man in his 60s could outrun a healthy college freshman. He stood up and bolted, sprinting all the way back to his dorm room. When he arrived, his roommate was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He collapsed onto his bed, trying to process the danger he had just escaped. A moment later, his phone buzzed again with a text from the number. The message was shockingly hostile. The man wrote that Nicholas was a little piece of garbage, that he was lucky he got away, and that he would have strangled his ugly face. Nicholas sat there in shock, realizing how close he had come to being abducted or worse. He replied to the message, stating that he was saving the screenshots and taking them straight to the police, and then he blocked the number. Our final story takes us back to when another young man was 18 years old, working a summer job that turned into a terrifying game of hide-and-seek. He was employed as a part-time janitor at his local high school during the summer months. His hours varied greatly depending on how much money he wanted to make. Some days he would work the morning shift starting at 9, and other times he would work the night shift, staying all the way until midnight. Because it was the summer, the school was mostly empty, and he was often left alone to lock up the building after the older full-time janitors went home. At the time, the high school had not yet installed security cameras in the hallways, leaving many blind spots throughout the massive building. One night, his supervisor, a man named Tom, had to leave the shift early to take care of some personal business. This meant the 18-year-old would be finishing up the final hours of his shift completely alone, and he would be responsible for locking all the doors and setting the alarms. Tom told him to text him if he ran into any issues, and then he left. The young man actually enjoyed being left alone, because it meant he could finish his work quickly and then spend the rest of his shift relaxing on his phone, or even leaving early while still getting paid. Before Tom left, he had given him one final task. He needed to take a large stack of extra metal chairs that had been used for an assembly in the gymnasium and move them down to the basement storage room. The young man figured he would get this chore done quickly so he could go home. He picked up a stack of 6 heavy chairs and began carrying them down the concrete stairs into the basement. The basement of the high school was not a pleasant place. It was dimly lit, cold, and felt more like an abandoned warehouse than a school facility. The storage room was filled with old school equipment, including several large art mannequins that were draped in dusty white paint cloths. These cloths looked like giant blankets, completely covering the figures. All of the school's extra art supplies were kept down here, and the atmosphere was naturally creepy. He set his first stack of chairs down in the designated corner and headed back up to the gym to grab more. A few minutes later, he returned to the basement carrying another stack of chairs. But as he walked into the storage room, he froze. One of the art mannequins in the front row was completely exposed. The large white cloth that had been covering it just minutes before had been pulled off and was now lying on the floor. He knew with absolute certainty that the mannequin had been covered when he was down here just moments ago. Panic began to set in. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Tom, telling him that he thought someone was down in the basement with him. Tom replied a moment later, asking what he meant. The young man explained that one of the art cloths had been moved. Tom took a minute to respond, finally texting back that no one else was supposed to be in the building. As the young man stood there reading the text, his eyes wandered to a dark corner of the storage room, just outside the reach of the dim overhead light. He noticed a large art cloth piled in the shadows, but as he stared at it, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The cloth was covering something, and that something was moving. It was a subtle, slow-shifting motion, as if someone was crouching underneath it, trying to stay perfectly still. There was undoubtedly a person hiding under that sheet. Terrified, the young man spun around, sprinted up concrete stairs, and slammed the basement door shut, locking it from the outside. He immediately texted Tom, telling him that someone was definitely hiding under a cloth in the basement, and that he was going to call the police. But Tom did not want to deal with the hassle of a police investigation. He texted back, telling the young man to be a man and go back down there to confront whoever it was, suggesting it was probably just a kid pulling a prank. Reluctantly, the young man unlocked the door and crept back down the stairs. When he reached the storage room, he saw that the cloth was now lying flat on the floor. Whoever had been hiding under it was gone. But then, the most terrifying moment of the night occurred. As he stood in the silence of the basement, a series of loud, metallic thumping sounds echoed from directly above his head. He looked up at the ceiling and saw the large metal air ducts. To his horror, he could see the metal surface of the vents slowly indenting downward. Someone was crawling through the narrow air ducts directly above him. The thumping stopped right above where he was standing, and then a violent rhythmic banging began, as if the heavy boots of the intruder inside the vent were trying to kick through the thin metal floor to get down to him. He did not wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran up the stairs, locked the school doors behind him, and drove straight home. The next day, he only told Tom a partial truth, claiming he thought he saw someone but they were gone when he went back. He was just glad it was his last week working at the school, and he never had to go back into that basement again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Let us start with the first story, which takes us to a quiet, winding road in South Jersey. Imagine driving down a road so dark that the only thing you can see is what your headlights decide to show you. It was late at night, and a police officer who had been on the force since he was 23 years old was doing exactly that. For the most part, his county was incredibly quiet. The worst calls he usually got on any given shift were minor neighbor disputes, noisy parties, or the occasional shoplifter at a local convenience store. He had done just about every shift imaginable, spending plenty of years on the grueling night shift. But on this particular night, the absolute silence of the road was about to be broken in the most unsettling way possible. He was cruising down a long stretch of two-lane road with thick, dense woods on both sides, and there were absolutely no streetlights to guide him. Out of nowhere, as he rounded a slight curve, he saw a faint red reflection up ahead on the right-hand side of the road. As he got closer, he realized it was the reflection of taillights. A car was parked on the grass, just off the shoulder of the road. What immediately caught his attention was that the driver's side door was wide open, casting a long shadow across the wet grass. The officer began to slow down, veering his patrol cruiser onto the grass to pull up directly behind the vehicle. He was fully planning on getting out of his car to see if the driver was having mechanical trouble or needed some sort of emergency assistance. But just as he brought his cruiser to a complete stop and shifted into park, the driver's side door of the mystery car moved. A figure stepped out of the vehicle. This person stood by the open door for just a fraction of a second, perfectly still in the dim light of the cruiser. And then, without warning or saying a single word, they turned and bolted straight into the thick, dark woods. And so the officer immediately radioed dispatch to report a suspicious person and a suspicious vehicle, giving them his exact coordinates on the dark road. He stepped out of his patrol car, drawing his flashlight with his left hand while keeping his right hand resting cautiously on his holster. In his line of work, you always have to expect the worst-case scenario. He walked up to the open driver's side door, shining his light into the cabin. He half expected to see a passenger sitting there, but the vehicle appeared completely empty. But the moment he got close to the open window, a wave of a foul odor hit him. It was a rancid, heavy smell that smelled exactly like a rotting animal that had been baking in the sun. The officer stepped back, shining his light toward the thick tree line. He called out, asking if anyone was in the woods or if they needed medical assistance, but there was no response. He took a few steps toward the trees, waving his flashlight around, but the thick brush and leaves swallowed the beam of light. Deciding it was safer to inspect the vehicle, first he walked back to the car. He shone his flashlight through the passenger window, and what he saw made his stomach turn. On the passenger side floorboard and scattered across the rear seats were multiple tissues and paper towels. But they were not white anymore. They were completely soaked in blood, looking dark red and heavy. At this point, the officer heard the distinct sound of rustling leaves and heavy footsteps coming from the dark woods behind him. He spun around, pointing his flashlight into the darkness, and yelled for whoever was out there to come out of the woods. He could not see anyone, but he knew they were hiding there. And then, a deep voice mumbled something from beyond the trees. The officer could not understand a single word, but the voice did not sound like someone who was in pain or bleeding out. He called out again, asking if the person was hurt, and prepared to draw his weapon. Still, there was no response. The officer realized how incredibly dangerous this situation was, so he backed up to his cruiser and requested urgent assistance. He turned on his flashing emergency lights to make it easier for other officers to find him on this pitch-black road. While waiting, he decided to look closer at the vehicle. He noticed there were no license plates on the car, and when he looked into the back seat again, he spotted something heavy, wrapped up tightly in bloody paper towels. Wearing his gloves, he reached in and carefully unwrapped it. It took his brain a moment to process what he was looking at, because it was so dark red and saturated with blood. It was a severed human hand. Now, the situation went from a routine investigation to an absolute nightmare. He quickly radioed dispatch to report a possible murder. When backup and the canine units arrived, they launched a massive search into the woods, looking for any signs of a body or a blood trail. But they found nothing. There was not even a single drop of blood leading from the car into the trees, which meant the driver who ran might not have been bleeding at all. The car itself turned out to be stolen from a resident of a nearby town, but the owner had no idea who could have taken it. Forensic teams dusted the steering wheel for fingerprints and ran DNA tests on the severed hand, but there was not a single match in any database. To this day, the driver has never been identified, and no one knows who that severed hand belonged to. But that is the thing about police work. Sometimes the mysteries do not end with a clear resolution, leaving you with a lingering sense of dread. For our second story, we look at another set of officers who worked in the sheriff department. This officer and his partner were assigned to a special unit that handled tethers and ankle monitors. This job involved tracking down people who had violated the terms of their release or probation. One night, they were out searching for a woman named Camille, who had absconded from the program and gone completely off the radar. They managed to track her last known location to a notoriously shady neighborhood in their county. They parked their vehicle and walked up to the house, knowing that very few stops in their line of work are ever truly routine. The officer partner walked up to the front door, while the officer himself took up a cover position on the side of the house. He kept his eyes locked on his partner and the side windows, making sure he was completely out of sight from anyone looking through the front door. His partner knocked loudly on the door. Almost immediately, they could hear movement coming from inside. And then, the front door slowly creaked open. A middle-aged woman peered out. But instead of looking at the partner standing right in front of her, she turned her head and stared directly at the officer hiding on the side of the house. The officer felt a chill run down his spine. There was absolutely no way she could have known he was standing there. He was completely out of the line of sight of any windows, yet her eyes locked onto him instantly. The partner asked if they could come inside, and after a brief moment of silence, she let them in. They asked her if she knew where Camille was. The woman mumbled something under her breath, indicating that Camille was indeed somewhere inside the house. But before they could ask any follow-up questions, the situation went from 0 to 100. The middle-aged woman suddenly dropped to her hands and knees. She began scooting across the floor, dragging herself along while screaming Camille's name at the top of her lungs. The officers realized this woman was dealing with severe mental health issues, and they assumed Camille might have been some kind of caretaker, but the atmosphere inside the house was incredibly heavy and wrong. It was around 8 o'clock at night, and it was pitch black outside. Inside the home, there was only one single light turned on. There were no televisions, no computers, no phones, and absolutely no electronics of any kind. The layout of the old house was incredibly bizarre. It was a 2-story home with about 4 bedrooms, but every time the officer walked out of a room, he felt completely disoriented. It was as if he was entering a dimensional gap. He would walk out of a bedroom expecting to be in the hallway he just came from, only to find himself in a completely different part of the house. And the most unsettling part was the woman. She would silently appear right behind him without making a single sound, her eyes wide as she scooted on the floor, calling out for Camille. Eventually, the 2 officers made their way upstairs. The second floor looked like a normal hallway with a few doors. They approached one door at the end of the hall, which they assumed led to another bedroom, or perhaps a bathroom. When the partner grabbed the handle and pushed, the door did not budge. It felt as if it had been sealed shut. Upon closer inspection, they realized the door had been painted over multiple times, and the dried paint had sealed the seams shut. The partner put some real muscle into it, forcing the door open with a loud crack. But behind the door, there was no bedroom. It was a dark, unfinished attic. It looked exactly like a scene from a horror movie, with nothing but exposed insulation, dusty storage boxes, and a single, old-fashioned light bulb hanging from a string in the center of the room. At the bottom of the attic stairs, the middle-aged woman sat on the floor, quietly watching them and occasionally calling out for Camille. After what felt like hours of searching the same rooms over and over again, feeling completely lost in a house that seemed to defy the laws of space, the officers decided to call off the search. They cleared the house and walked out to their patrol car. As they drove away, they looked back at the front door. The woman was standing in the doorway, completely upright, staring blankly at them as they disappeared into the night. But when they checked their dispatch log to see how long they had been inside, they received a shock. According to the dispatcher, they had only been inside the house for 20 minutes. To both officers, it felt like they had been trapped in that strange, shifting house for at least 2 hours. They have never returned to that property, and the memory of that night still haunts them. Now, some police calls do not leave you with spooky questions, but rather with a deep, tragic scar that never truly heals. Our third story takes us to the rural landscapes of Middle Georgia, a place where people generally live quiet, peaceful lives. The narrator's cousin, whom we will call Bob, had been a police officer for about 5 years. Bob joined the force with a lot of optimism, genuinely wanting to protect and help improve the lives of the people in his community. One afternoon, Bob and his partner received an alert to conduct a welfare check at a home located somewhere between the towns of Macon and Roberta. To the locals, this house was believed to have been abandoned for years. It was heavily overgrown with weeds, with peeling paint and sagging porches. But when Bob and his partner arrived, they saw an older gentleman sitting on the front steps outside the main door. It was an older man, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. As Bob and his partner approached him, they noticed the man was sobbing uncontrollably. He was muttering to himself, repeating over and over again how awful it was. Bob tried to ask him what was wrong, but the man was completely incoherent, clearly in a state of severe shock and trauma. While his partner called for an additional car, Bob drew his weapon and decided to step inside the house to investigate. The moment he crossed the threshold, an incredibly rancid, overpowering smell hit him. It was a smell that Bob knew all too well, but this was far worse than anything he had ever encountered in his career. He walked into the kitchen, and it was clear the occupants were extreme hoarders. Pots, pans, and dirty dishes were stacked nearly to the ceiling. Moldy, spoiled food was scattered across the table, and empty takeout containers littered the dirty floor. Bob called out, announcing himself as a police officer, but the only response was dead silence. He kept his gun drawn, his heart pounding in his chest as he moved down a narrow hallway. The terrible smell grew stronger with every single step he took. It became so thick that Bob had to cover his mouth and nose with his sleeve just to breathe. He reached the end of the hall and pushed open the bedroom door. Sitting on the bed were 2 decomposing bodies. Their skin had turned a sickening shade of gray, and the room was filled with the buzzing of hundreds of flies. Bob walked closer to inspect the scene, a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. One of the bodies was a male, and the other was a female. The decomposition was already advanced, with the skin on their faces starting to slough off. Flies were crawling in and out of their open mouths and landing on their open, glassy eyes. But as Bob looked closer at the female corpse, his heart stopped. Clutched tightly in her arms was an even smaller, lifeless bundle. It was an infant. As Bob stared in absolute horror, a large cockroach crawled out of the dead baby's mouth. That was the breaking point for Bob. He spun around, ran out of the bedroom, sprinted down the hallway, and burst through the front door. He stumbled down the steps and threw up his lunch right onto the grass near where the older man had been sitting. When backup finally arrived, they were able to piece together the tragic story. The older man on the porch was actually a former co-worker and close friend of the dead man. They had worked together at a local peach packing company. The husband had not shown up for work in over a week, so the friend decided to drive out to the house to check on him, only to discover the horrific scene in the bedroom. It turns out the husband and wife had both become deeply addicted to prescription opioids following a medical operation a year prior. Their addiction quickly spiraled out of control, leading them to abuse painkillers before eventually turning to heroin. Because of their severe addiction, they had completely neglected their baby daughter, who died of starvation and neglect in her crib. When the parents finally realized what they had done, the guilt and horror broke them completely. They decided to end their own lives, injecting themselves with massive, lethal doses of heroin. The coroner confirmed they had enough drugs in their systems to kill them multiple times over. Bob is still on the force today, but the tragedy changed him. He struggled with alcohol for a while to numb the memories, and though therapy helped him get clean, he still suffers from recurring nightmares where he hears that poor baby crying in the dark. But of all the calls a police officer can receive, perhaps the most dangerous are the ones where an active threat is hiding right in front of them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Our final story begins with a frantic call to dispatch from a young woman who lived all alone. She explained to the operator that she had just arrived home to find one of her downstairs windows completely shattered. She had searched the downstairs area and found that nothing seemed to be stolen, and there was no sign of an intruder. But then, when she finally went upstairs to go to bed, she began to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing around on the hardwood floors downstairs. But the problem was, mid-sentence, her phone call abruptly disconnected. The dispatcher tried to call her back multiple times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. An officer nearby took the call and rushed to the scene. He pulled up to the quiet house, walked up the porch steps, and knocked firmly on the front door. He waited, but there was no response. He rang the doorbell and knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained completely dark and silent. Knowing that something was very wrong, the officer decided to walk around the perimeter of the house to investigate. He made his way to the back and immediately spotted the broken window the woman had described. The window pane was completely shattered, leaving an opening large enough for a person to easily climb through. The officer shone his flashlight through the broken window, calling out that he was a police officer and asking if anyone was inside. He heard nothing but silence. He radioed dispatch to let them know he was entering the house through the broken window, because he feared the homeowner might be in immediate danger. He carefully climbed through the frame, stepping onto the kitchen floor while the broken glass crunched loudly beneath his heavy boots. He drew his service weapon, keeping his flashlight pointed ahead as he moved slowly through the dark kitchen and into the living room. He continued to call out his presence, hoping to hear a reply, but the house was dead silent. He knew the woman had told dispatch she was upstairs when she heard the footsteps, so he made his way toward the staircase. He did not try to be completely silent as he climbed, wanting any potential intruder to know a police officer was on the premises, but he remained highly alert. As he reached the top of the stairs, he called out, asking if anyone was there. To his relief, a soft, trembling female voice answered from a bedroom down the hall, saying that she was there. The officer followed the voice and walked into a bedroom. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he saw a young woman sitting upright in her bed, pulled tightly under the covers. He kept his flashlight pointed away from her face and asked if she was okay. She nodded and said she was fine, but the officer instantly picked up on a slight, terrified tremble in her voice. He asked her why she had hung up the phone and why she did not answer any of the dispatcher's callbacks. She began to stutter, nervously stating that no one was in the house and that everything was fine, but as she spoke, the officer noticed her eyes darting nervously. He immediately caught on to the fact that something was terribly wrong. He looked toward the bedroom closet and gave her a subtle nod, silently asking if someone was hiding in there. The woman very slightly shook her head. No. The officer then lowered his gaze toward the bottom of the bed. He pointed his finger toward the dark space underneath the bed frame and looked at her. This time, the woman gave a tiny, almost unnoticeable nod of her head. Yes, at this point the pressure on the officer's shoulders felt like 1,000 pounds. He knew that if he drew his weapon and searched under the bed right then, a gunfight could break out with the woman sitting right there in the line of fire. He had to think of a way to get her out of the room safely. He cleared his throat and told her in a calm, professional voice that he just needed her to sign a standard police report form, stating that he had responded to the call and found nothing unusual. The woman agreed, slowly sliding out from under the covers and walking toward him. The moment she was close enough, the officer grabbed her arm, quickly pushed her out of the bedroom into the hallway, and drew his service weapon. He spun around, pointed his gun at the space beneath the bed, and screamed for the intruder to come out with their hands up and drop any weapons. For a second there was silence, and then he heard the heavy metallic clank of a handgun hitting the floorboards. Slowly, a dark figure began to crawl out from under the bed. It was a middle-aged man dressed entirely in black clothing. He raised his hands and surrendered, and the officer quickly secured him in handcuffs just as backup arrived at the front door. It turns out, the moment the woman had heard the footsteps upstairs, she had hung up the phone out of fear that the intruder would hear her speaking to dispatch. But before she could escape, the man had burst into her room and held her at gunpoint. When the officer arrived and rang the doorbell, the intruder forced the woman to stay in bed, warning her that he would shoot her dead if she made a single sound. He then hid under the bed, keeping his weapon trained on her, expecting her to lie to the police and send them away. Thanks to the officer's quick thinking and the woman's silent bravery, a tragedy was averted, and a dangerous criminal was taken off the streets. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I hate to travel. I especially hate to travel for work. There is just something about leaving the comfort of your own home, your own bed, and your daily routine that really drains you. But about a year ago, I had to travel to a spot that was only about a 3-hour drive from where I work. The area I had to go to was actually considered beautiful by a lot of people who visit it. It was scenic, peaceful, and had a lot of nature. So, I thought to myself that this would be a great excuse to bring my wife along with me. She absolutely hates it when I have to travel for work, so this seemed like a really good opportunity to finally include her. I figured that while I was busy during the day, she could go out and enjoy the local sights, go hiking, do some shopping, or honestly just sit around the house and relax. Either way, the plan was that I would be back every afternoon and evening for us to do whatever she wanted to do. We ended up renting this cute little house that was mostly secluded. It was not like it was out in the middle of absolute nowhere, but it was definitely separated from the other houses in the neighborhood by a thick bunch of trees. On that first night when we finally arrived, we walked around the house to check it out. I remember my wife looking around and saying that she would absolutely love to buy a house just like this one someday. Even though the house itself was on the smaller side, it had a massive basement that was completely filled with various storage boxes and old furniture. Little did I know at the time that our short trip was only going to get worse and worse from that moment on. On that very first morning of the trip, I woke up at 6 in the morning to get ready for my work meeting. After I rolled over and turned my alarm off, the very first thing I noticed was that my wife was not in the bed next to me. That immediately caused me to jump out of bed with a little bit of fire in my step. I went out into the kitchen, and there she was, sitting on one of the bar stools, drinking a cup of coffee and scrolling through her phone. When I asked her why on earth she was awake so early, she looked up at me and told me that she simply could not sleep. She explained that she had suddenly woken up in the middle of the night. When she rolled over to adjust herself, she thought she could see someone standing perfectly still in the far corner of our bedroom. She tried to squint and focus her eyes in the dark, but it was just too dark in the room to be absolutely certain of what she was seeing. So she rolled back over and tried to ignore it, but she just could not get back to sleep after that. She said she almost fell back asleep at one point, but then she thought she heard a strange noise coming from that exact same corner of the room. After that, she was wide awake and her heart was racing. She told me she just could not shake the terrifying feeling that someone was standing there in the dark watching her sleep. At 5 in the morning, she finally decided she had enough. She got up, made some coffee, and had been sitting out in the kitchen ever since. I felt absolutely terrible for her. I could see the sheer exhaustion written all over her face. I could even see that she was still a little bit scared from the experience. I went ahead and got ready for work, and before I left, I asked her if she was going to be okay. She told me that she was going to get herself ready and go explore the local town while I was at my work obligation. She explained that she did not want to stay at the house alone for any longer than she absolutely needed to. As I was getting ready to walk out the door, she was laying out her clothes on the bed so they would be ready for her after she finished her shower. I kissed her goodbye, and she jumped right into the shower. According to what she told me later, When she finally got out of the shower, she noticed that her clothes were sitting slightly differently from how she had left them on the bed. Instead of being folded neatly and stacked on top of each other like she had done, they were now half folded and just thrown out into a single messy row across the mattress. At this point, she was already on edge from the night before, but she tried to convince herself that it must have just been her imagination playing tricks on her. She got dressed as quickly as she could, but then she realized she could not find her socks anywhere. She knew for a fact that she had left the socks out on the bed with the rest of her clothes, but now they were simply gone. She searched under the pillows and even checked her suitcase, but they were nowhere to be found. She felt like she was going crazy. She quickly grabbed another pair of socks from her suitcase, put them on, and ran right out of the house. Since I had the car for my work meetings, she had to call an Uber to get into town. During the day, I could tell that something was definitely off with her. When she was texting me back and forth, I was getting these short, one-word answers, and that is just not like her at all. She is usually a very expressive and talkative person, so the sudden silence made me feel uneasy. Luckily, I got out of my work meeting a bit early that afternoon, so I decided to meet my wife for lunch in town. When I finally saw her, she really did not look well. She looked pale and incredibly stressed out. This was the moment where she sat me down and told me all about the bizarre clothes situation and how her socks had just magically gone missing from the bed. I honestly did not even know what to say to her. I believed her completely, of course, because I knew she would never make something like that up. I just did not have any logical solution or any idea of what could possibly be happening in that rental house. Since I was officially done with my work for the day, we decided to spend the rest of the afternoon walking around town, visiting local shops, and just having a great time together to get her mind off of things. By the time night came around, we had dinner back at the house, and my wife was looking much better and seemed way more relaxed. Whatever weirdness was happening earlier and bothering her so much seemed to be completely over now. But then, in the middle of the night, she suddenly woke me up by shaking my shoulder. She whispered to me that she had just heard a really weird noise. As soon as she said that, I lay perfectly still in the bed, and I could hear it as well. It sounded like the distinct noise of someone walking around quietly inside the house. I could feel her body shaking next to me. She begged me not to leave the bed, but I knew I needed to go and find out if there was actually someone in the house with us. I quietly stood up and walked through the dark hallway, checking every room. The only thing I noticed that was even slightly out of the ordinary was that one of the closet doors was open. Now, I know this sounds incredibly stupid, but I just assumed the door had somehow opened on its own. I know that is highly unlikely, but I have had closet doors do that in older houses before. I even started to rationalize it in my head, thinking that the sound we had heard must have just been the creaking of the closet door as it slowly slid open. I even looked directly inside the closet just to be absolutely sure, and it was completely empty. I walked back to the bedroom and told my wife that the house was totally clear and that we had absolutely nothing to worry about. But she had it firmly stuck in her mind that something was not right. She could not sleep at all after that. So, I decided to be a supportive husband and stay up with her for the rest of the night. When morning finally arrived, I got ready for work, and she quickly got dressed too. She made it very clear that she did not want to stay a single second in that house without me there. We met up for lunch again later that day, and she immediately asked if we could go back to the house, pack up our things, and just leave early. I felt absolutely terrible because I had to tell her that we needed to stay for just one more night. The problem was that I had one final, extremely important meeting scheduled for the next morning that I simply could not miss. This was definitely not the relaxing, fun trip that I had wanted for us. The thought of having to stay in that house for even one more night was absolutely crippling to her. I felt so bad that I offered to get us a hotel room instead, but because I had already spent so much money renting this house, she eventually agreed to tough it out for just one final night. When we got back to the house after lunch, we went ahead and packed up all of our suitcases ahead of time so we could leave immediately after my meeting the next morning. We ordered a pizza for dinner that night and sat in the living room trying to distract ourselves. I could tell she was terrified of going to sleep. We ended up playing this trivia game on my phone for a couple of hours just to keep our minds active. But every so often we would hear this weird, dull noise coming from the basement below us. Every single time we heard that sound, my wife would just crumble and look at me with sheer terror in her eyes. I tried my best to comfort her, telling her that it was probably just an old house, making normal creaking noises as the temperature changed. But she could not accept that explanation. While we were sitting there, I decided that I had to go and check the basement one more time. She begged me not to go down there, but I told her that I wanted to prove to her once and for all that the house was safe and that she had absolutely nothing to worry about. I walked over, opened the basement door, and headed down the wooden steps. I looked all around the room. There were boxes of storage and old furniture stacked absolutely everywhere. There was only one light bulb in the entire basement, and it was not a good one. It gave off this very dim, yellow, creepy glow. Just as I was about to turn around and head back upstairs to my wife, something caught my eye in the corner. I turned back around, and standing perfectly still in the dark corner of that room was a man wearing a red hat. He was standing so incredibly still that for a split second, I swear I thought it was just a hat rack or maybe some kind of mannequin that the owners had stored down there. But then, as I moved just a little bit closer to get a better look, the man blinked. I completely freaked out. My heart jumped into my throat, and I turned around and sprinted up the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. I ran into the living room and told my wife that we had to get to the car right away, and that I would grab the bags. We had 3 bags in total. I grabbed 2 of the heavy suitcases and literally threw them outside onto the porch. My wife quickly grabbed them and started loading them into the car while I ran back inside to grab our very last bag. I ran into the bedroom, yanked our phone chargers out of the wall, and grabbed the final bag. But as I was running back toward the front door, I noticed that the basement door was now wide open, and the closet door in the hallway was also slightly ajar. I took a deep, shaky breath, and I sprinted past the closet and the basement door. I literally threw the last bag into the back seat of the car, jumped into the driver's seat, and drove off as fast as I could. As we were driving away, I called the rental manager on the phone and tried to explain that there was an active intruder inside the house. But the woman on the other end of the line just started arguing with me, trying to tell me that I must have been mistaken or that I was seeing things. I do not even know if she ever actually followed up on what I said. I got so incredibly angry at her dismissal that I just hung up the phone on her. Thankfully, we made it out of there completely okay. But just because we managed to escape unscathed does not make the situation any less scary to think about. That man was literally wandering around that house with us all weekend long. I believe my wife without a doubt now when she says she saw someone standing in the bedroom on that first night. It was almost certainly that same guy from the basement. I do not even want to think about what that guy actually wanted with us, or why he was stealing my wife's socks. I know I probably could have pursued the situation further with the police or the rental platform, but at that point, I just wanted to let it be and put the whole nightmare behind us. Having your own private house to stay in while you travel is a really cool idea, but I honestly think I am going to stick to normal hotels for a very long time. They might have their own creepy moments, but at least in a hotel, you actually expect to have other people walking around. People who, hopefully, will not be hiding in your basement and watching you sleep. And so you would think that staying at a luxury resort would solve all of your safety worries, right? That is exactly what I thought too. But the problem is that danger can find you even in paradise. I like to travel, but I really do not like to travel all by myself. So whenever I have the chance, I will try to pave the way for whatever girl I am seeing at the time to accompany me on my trips. One of the more memorable trips I ever took was a vacation to Costa Rica with this girl named Julie, whom I was seeing at the time. We stayed at the Four Seasons, which is a damn beautiful resort in every single way. It was honestly one of the nicest, most luxurious places I have ever stayed at in my entire life. The trip was memorable not just because of the sheer beauty of the resort and the surrounding jungle, but because of the insanely weird and deeply disturbing experience we ended up having toward the very end of our stay. We were staying there for a total of 4 nights, which, trust me, already cost me a very pretty penny. The place was not cheap by any means, but the amenities were absolutely top tier, and life was honestly amazing for the first 3 days of our vacation. On our third night, late at night, after we had eaten a delicious dinner and sat on the beach watching this incredible fire show, the pool and the public areas slowly started to clear out. Eventually, it got to the point where it was just the two of us left awake. We decided it would be fun to run back to our room, grab the bottle of tequila we had bought, along with a few mixers, and bring them down to the outdoor hot tub near the pool. The hot tub was beautiful, covered in just about every direction by thick jungle trees and tropical plants, except for a very narrow opening used to get in and out. There was also a large decorative waterfall flowing into the hot tub, which made a lot of splashing noise. Because of the waterfall, we could be as loud as we wanted to be without worrying about disturbing anyone else. We were having some fun, drinking our drinks, and just enjoying ourselves in the warm water. But our fun was abruptly interrupted when I happened to glance through the thick plants and noticed that someone was on the other side creeping around. This was not just a regular person walking along the resort walkway. This person was crouching down low to the ground, moving slowly through the bushes as if they were actively spying on us while we were in the hot tub. I immediately shouted out aloud, angry, "Hey," and then I struggled to get out of the hot tub. Let us face it, getting out of a pool or a hot tub takes a few awkward seconds to do, especially when you are relaxed. By the time I finally got my feet onto the solid concrete and made my way onto the walkway, I saw a figure hurrying away in the distance before they turned a sharp corner and completely disappeared. Julie was calling out to me from the hot tub, telling me to just come back and leave it alone, but I was frustrated. I ran ahead anyway, and I turned that exact same corner that the man had just disappeared behind. But when I did, I saw absolutely nothing but an empty, dark trail leading back toward the guest units. It was actually heading directly in the direction of our own unit, too. When I finally walked back to the hot tub, Julie and I tried to have a mild laugh about the whole thing, but in reality, the good vibe was completely dead. We just did not feel like we had any privacy anymore. We grabbed our towels, dried off, and started the walk back to our room. To get from the pool section back to our specific unit, you had to walk along a path that was pretty dark at night. The path was situated right between the resort buildings on one side and the thick, wild jungle on the right side. When we got directly across from our unit, which was located on the very first floor, we suddenly heard a loud rustling noise coming from the jungle to our right. Now, keep in mind, this is a real jungle, and there are animals everywhere, so you are bound to hear rustling noises all the time. But this particular rustling stood out immediately because it sounded much bigger and way more intense than any animal. It sounded completely human-made. Julie got really scared, grabbed my arm, and pleaded with me to just go inside. I told her to go ahead, and I handed her our wooden room keycard so she could unlock the door. I stepped closer to the edge of the path and took a closer look into the dark jungle foliage. As I stood there staring into the shadows, I started to hear this bizarre buzzing sound. It did not sound like any bug or animal I had ever heard. Instead, it sounded like a human being making a low, creepy grumbling or buzzing noise with the back of their throat. Suddenly, whatever or whoever was hiding in those bushes scattered away deeper into the thick jungle, and I was left standing there on the path with my heart beating in my throat. I hurried to follow Julie inside the room, and I slammed the heavy door shut behind me. She had not heard the weird throat buzzing sound, but she had definitely heard the sound of someone scurrying away into the brush. It felt like someone was actively stalking us at this point. We checked the locks and just decided to go to bed, reassuring ourselves that nobody could get into a locked resort room anyway. The next day, while we were lounging by the beach, we decided to tell one of the resort workers about the weird encounter we had the night before. We did not want to make a massive scene, but we thought it was important to give them a friendly warning so they could keep an eye out for any strange behavior for the sake of the other guests. We stayed on the beach for a few hours, relaxing under the sun. During that time, a man dressed in what looked like an official resort employee uniform walked up to us holding a camera. He smiled warmly and told us to pose and smile for a photo. So we did. He took the picture, smiled again, said thank you, and walked away. We watched him go, expecting him to walk up to other couples or families on the beach to take more pictures. But when we looked up just a few seconds later, the The guy had completely vanished from the beach. It was also worth noting that every single other worker at this resort was local Costa Rican. This dude, however, was white. Now, that is obviously not the craziest thing in the world, but this guy was exceptionally white, even whiter than Julie and me, which was something we both pointed out and joked about to each other. Fast forward to that night, and things were actually going really well. We got a nice dinner, watched a beautiful sunset, explored the property a bit more, and just relaxed. We had an early flight to catch the next morning, so we decided to call it a night pretty early. We were exhausted from the trip and fell asleep easily. However, in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up in a pitch-black room. It had to be the early hours of the morning, somewhere between midnight and 1:30. I woke up facing the sliding glass door that led out to our private patio. Our suite had this great patio with a large sliding door, and the patio itself was completely screened off to prevent tropical bugs from getting inside. We had decided to leave that heavy glass sliding door open that night, so we could listen to the peaceful sounds of the jungle animals and the waves crashing on the shore. But as I lay there, I heard a very different sound coming from the patio. I thought for sure it was the distinct sound of a camera beeping as it took a picture. I was only about 30% sure of it at first, until I heard it again. It was the undeniable shutter click and electronic beep of a digital camera. I sat upright in bed and my eyes adjusted to the dark. I could see a solid black silhouette of a person standing on the other side of the screen on our patio, looking right at us. I shouted out a loud, angry hey once again, trying to sound tough, but deep down, I was absolutely terrified. All I could see of this person was their dark silhouette, and I watched as they turned and ran away into the darkness of the resort grounds. Julie woke up from my shouting, and I told her exactly what I had just witnessed. I quickly jumped out of bed, slammed the heavy glass patio door shut, locked it, and immediately called the front desk. I made a very loud, anxious, and angry report of what had just happened, and I demanded that they send security to our room right away. An employee arrived about 10 minutes later, and I explained everything to him. I told him about the stalker from the night before, the strange white man with the camera on the beach, and now this person taking photos of us while we slept. The employee looked at me with a serious face and said that the resort does not have any employees who walk around taking random pictures of guests. That confirmed it. It was the exact same person. In fact, it was highly likely that this same individual had been stalking us for the past 2 days. I demanded that they move us to a new room because we did not feel safe sleeping there. The employee agreed and also promised that they would check all of their security camera footage from the past 2 days. We were quickly moved to another suite that was located much closer to the main lobby hall, and you can bet that we kept the patio door in this new room locked tight. We woke up very early the next morning for our flight. The resort offered a shuttle service to the airport, so we went to the lobby to check out. While we were standing at the front desk, the manager actually showed us some of the video surveillance footage they had gathered. The footage showed the man who had been stalking us. He was captured on camera, creepily walking around the resort grounds, following us. Based on the videos they showed us, he only ever took pictures of Julie and me, nobody else. It was the most horrifying and deeply confusing thing to witness. We could not stay to watch more because we were in a serious hurry to catch our flight, but the staff assured us that if they found the man, serious legal action would be taken. We were just incredibly relieved to be getting on that plane and leaving the country. I followed up with the resort a few days after we got back home, but they apologized and said they did not have any new updates, which was really disappointing. I do not see Julie anymore, but this remains a truly crazy and disturbing experience that the two of us will share forever. And sometimes I still think about reaching out to her just to talk about it again. But the problem was that some nightmares do not wait for you to reach your beautiful vacation destination. Sometimes, the journey itself is where things go horribly wrong. I hate reliving this next story, but I feel like it is just so crazy that I need to share it with people. Last year, I managed to get a week and a half off from my job, so I decided to make the trip back home to visit my parents. I currently live and work down in South Carolina, but my entire family still lives up in Massachusetts. It is obviously not right around the corner, but it is a relatively easy and straightforward drive if you do it right. My parents are getting older now and are completely retired. They do not really get to leave the house very much these days, because my dad severely hurt his back years ago when he was still working. So, my genius idea was that I was going to drive throughout the entire night and surprise my parents by pulling up to their house first thing in the morning. I only told my brother about my plan, just so that someone in the family knew I was on the road in case of an emergency. Usually, I absolutely hate driving at night, but I had found that this specific drive up north is actually way easier to do overnight. There is barely any traffic on the highway, so I can just put on a podcast or some music and chill out while I drive. My absolute least favorite part of the entire drive is when I have to go through the state of Pennsylvania. No disrespect to any of my people living in Pennsylvania, but that state honestly feels like it never ends. It is just hours and hours of endless mountains and winding, dark roads. Not to mention, I feel like every single time I drive through Pennsylvania, the weather is so incredibly foggy that I feel like I am driving through an endless wall of solid white, and this trip was absolutely no different. I was white-knuckling my steering wheel, trying to peer through the thick fog, until I suddenly came across a bright orange detour sign. Apparently, there had been a bad accident up ahead on the highway, so all traffic was being redirected off the main road and onto the local side roads. I continued driving along the detour for a while, and it did not take long for me to start feeling completely lost. It was just a dark, winding, foggy road with absolutely no signs of life anywhere around. Of course, to make matters worse, my cell phone had absolutely no service out there, so I could not even use my GPS to figure out where I was or where I was supposed to be going. It had been hours since I had left my apartment in South Carolina, and the exhaustion was starting to hit me hard. I was desperately scanning the side of the road, looking for a gas station, a diner, or even just a rest stop. I knew I needed to shut my eyes for at least a few minutes, but I did not feel comfortable pulling over and sleeping on the shoulder of this completely desolate road. Something about driving in heavy fog and having to focus extra hard on the road makes your brain get tired twice as fast. I started to doze off, purely because of my sheer physical exhaustion. I knew I should have pulled over the very second I started doing the head drop, but I stupidly thought I could hold on for just a little bit longer until I found a safe spot. Well, it turns out I could not. I dozed off for a second too long, and I completely lost control of the car. I jerked the steering wheel in a panic, but it was already too late. My car slammed hard into the metal guardrail, and then it just kept going. The car rolled over down into a steep dirt ditch, and thankfully, by some miracle, it rolled all the way back to an upright position on its wheels. I sat there in the dark, shaking uncontrollably. That was, without a doubt, the most terrifying moment of my entire life. If you have ever been flipped upside down inside a car, you know exactly what kind of panic I am talking about. I just sat there for a few minutes in the quiet, trying to catch my breath and make sure I was not bleeding. I grabbed my phone to see if I could somehow call for help, but it would not have mattered if I had service anyway. The screen was completely shattered and destroyed from the impact of the crash. At that moment, sitting in the dark car, I had no idea how bad the damage was on the outside. I started the engine and tried to drive the car out of the steep ditch, but the wheels just spun in the dirt. It was completely stuck and there was no moving it. Because of the awkward angle that the car was resting at, I could barely even push my driver's side door open against the dirt wall of the ditch. When I finally managed to squeeze my way out of the car, I slowly crawled up the steep dirt bank of the ditch and stood on the side of the dark road. I stood there in complete amazement, looking down at the heavy damage on my vehicle. I felt so stupid, and I wanted to just crawl under a rock and hide. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. A few minutes later, I was sitting on the cold ground next to the road, basically grieving on the inside and wondering how I was going to get out of this mess. While I was sitting there in the dark, I suddenly saw two bright headlights slowly cutting through the thick fog. I thought about standing up and flagging them down, but a weird gut feeling made me decide to just stay quiet and watch. The vehicle was a large pickup truck, and it drove past me very slowly. It stopped about 20 feet in front of me, and then it started to slowly reverse back toward where I was sitting. When they got right next to me, the driver rolled down the window. I could see an older couple sitting inside the truck. The woman was sitting in the passenger seat, and she made a polite comment about how I looked like I could use some help. I did not answer her right away. They seemed very nice on the surface, but this was the very first car I had seen on this road in hours, and it was the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. Nice or not, I was a little bit uneasy about the situation. I also do not want to be that guy, but they did not physically look like the most inviting or friendly people you would want to meet in the dark. She asked me again if I needed some help, and I just slowly nodded my head. At that point, the large man in the driver's seat got out of the truck and walked to the back to grab a heavy towing chain from the bed of the truck. While he was doing that, the older woman also got out of the passenger side and started slowly walking toward me. As she got closer, I noticed that she smelled absolutely horrible, like rotting garbage and old sweat. The way she was slowly inching toward me actually forced me to keep stepping backward toward the back of their truck. It was almost like she was physically bullying me with her movement, forcing me to go where she wanted. She started talking about the local land, and then she suddenly went off on this bizarre, angry government rant. I did not want to make her angry, so I just kept nodding my head and pretending to agree with everything she was saying. I just wanted to see these people hook up the chain and pull my car out of the ditch so I could get out of there. But she kept getting closer, literally bumping into my shoulder while she was ranting. Eventually, I was standing right outside the back tailgate of their truck. She had basically forced me all the way back there. She suddenly stopped her rant, looked at me, and smiled a very creepy smile. She told me that she wanted to show me something really cool that they had in the bed of the truck. I told her that it was okay, and that I just wanted to watch her husband pull my car out and make sure he did not need any help with the chain. But every single time I tried to step away from the back of the truck, she would physically move to cut me off. She just kept insisting, telling me that I really needed to look at what was in the back of the truck. That was when I noticed the large husband walking back over from the other side of the truck, but he did not have the towing chain in his hands anymore. Before I knew what was happening, both of them were closing in on me, blocking me in. I turned around and looked into the bed of the truck, and I noticed a large, dirty blue tarp laying over something. There was clearly something bulky underneath it, but I did not want to find out what it was. But just as I turned my back to look at the tarp, the older woman suddenly screamed out the name, Paul. In an instant, a third person emerged from underneath the dirty tarp in the truck bed, holding a large knife. He was a younger man, and he immediately lunged forward and attempted to grab me with his other hand. I still do not know how I managed to do it, but I was somehow able to dodge his grasp by basically falling backward onto the dirt ground. While I was laying on the ground, the older woman started to yell frantically, screaming at the two men to catch me. I scrambled to my feet and I started to run as fast as my legs could possibly carry me. I made the split-second decision to run straight into the dark woods instead of staying on the road. I did not want to take the chance of these insane locals chasing me down in their truck or shooting at me with a rifle. The younger guy with the knife chased me into the thick trees, but thankfully I was younger and faster and I was able to outrun him in the dark. I ended up hiding behind some thick bushes in the forest for a long time. Since my phone screen was completely destroyed, I had absolutely no concept of time, and I had no idea how long I was actually hiding in those woods. It felt like hours, but in reality I am sure it was not actually that long. I thought I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps walking through the leaves the entire time I was hiding. It was probably just the normal, natural sounds of the forest at night, but I was too terrified to risk moving. Just when I was getting ready to creep back toward the road, I suddenly heard the raspy voice of the old woman nearby. She kept calling out into the trees, referring to me as Sonny Boy. She was not standing right next to me, thankfully, but she was definitely close enough that I could hear her voice clearly. She was close enough that if I stepped on a dry twig, she would have heard it. She was shouting into the woods, telling me that everything was okay and that I could come out now. She said that they had successfully pulled my car out of the ditch for me and that they did not mean to scare me. I may be a fool, but I was certainly not stupid enough to fall for that. I held my breath, pressed myself flat against the dirt, and prayed that she would turn and walk in the other direction. A while longer passed, and I did not hear any more voices or footsteps. I slowly snuck my way out of the woods and made it back to the road. When I looked down into the ditch, my car was still sitting there, completely stuck. Clearly, she had been lying to try and lure me out. But as I got closer to my car, I realized that all of my car doors were now wide open, and my personal duffel bag had been dragged out and completely torn apart. I tried to quickly take an inventory of my things, but most of my valuable belongings were completely gone. It also looked like they had used that large knife to viciously slash up my leather seats. Their pickup truck was nowhere to be seen, but I knew I could not stay there with my disabled car. I had a strong gut feeling that they would eventually come back to finish the job if I stayed. So, I started walking down the dark road in the opposite direction. I walked for what felt like miles until I eventually came across a 24-hour gas station on the side of a larger highway. I ran inside, looking like a complete lunatic, and tried to explain to the young cashier what had just happened to me. I was a complete shaking mess. The cashier was clearly creeped out by me, and he refused to let me use the store phone, but he did agree to call the police for me. When the police finally showed up, they took my statement and helped me call my parents. It took a few hours, but my brother finally showed up at the police station to pick me up. Unfortunately, the local police were almost no help at all. They basically told me that without a license plate number or a solid description of the truck, there was not much they could do in that massive rural county. I was just incredibly happy to finally be driving home with my brother in the middle of the bright day. I cannot even begin to imagine what the actual intentions of those backwoods freaks were. I do not think they just wanted to rob me of my bag. I felt like whatever they had planned for me under that tarp, it was something much, much worse. My parents were definitely surprised when I finally walked through their door, but obviously it was not for the happy reasons I had originally planned. That was the absolute last time I have ever driven anywhere far at night by myself, and it will most likely be the last time I ever attempt that drive again. And that brings us to our final story, where a beautiful sunny vacation destination turned into a scene of absolute primitive terror. When people think about traveling for a vacation, they almost always think about going somewhere with a beach. That is because most people desperately need a break from the constant stress of their jobs or school, and they just want to unwind. And honestly, what better place is there to relax than on a beautiful warm beach with the sound of the ocean waves? But this story, unfortunately, was not a relaxing getaway at all. A couple of years ago, my girlfriend Ally and I decided to take a trip down south to enjoy some much-needed vacation time. Both of us work as professional nurses, and as any nurse will tell you, the burnout is very real, and sometimes you just desperately need a break from the hospital. We live up in New Hampshire, which is a beautiful state, but we really wanted to experience some of that hot southern sun. So, we decided to book a trip all the way down to Key West of Florida. Now, Allie absolutely hates to fly. It gives her massive anxiety, so we decided to make the drive instead. It is an over 24-hour drive from New Hampshire to the Florida Keys, but because we had both saved up a lot of vacation time, we took a full 2 weeks off. This made the drive itself feel way less stressful because we were able to make several fun stops along the way. When we finally arrived in Key West a few days later, we were completely blown away by how amazing our resort was. We were located right on the ocean, and the whole trip was exactly what we needed to recharge our batteries. Most of our vacation served its purpose perfectly, right up until one terrifying night. Our very last night in Key West showed me that no matter how safe or beautiful a place might seem, things can quickly spiral completely out of your control. Ally and I were lying down on the beach late at night, watching the bright moon reflect off the calm water. It was one of those rare nights where the light from the full moon was so incredibly bright that it literally did not even look like it was nighttime. We had laid out a large beach towel on the sand, and Allie was resting peacefully in my arms. What she did not know at the time was that I actually had a diamond engagement ring hiding in my pocket. This was supposed to be our big night, the moment I asked her to marry me. I started to get romantic, whispering sweet, mushy lines into her ear. At first, she was smiling and loving it. But then, I noticed that she suddenly went completely quiet. It was like she was not responding to anything I was saying. For a second, I thought she might have just fallen asleep in my arms. I jokingly asked her if she was still alive, and she quickly apologized for getting so quiet. She whispered that she had gotten distracted by two people who were standing kind of close to us on the sand. She said it looked like they were just standing there, staring directly at us. I sat up a bit and looked around, scanning the beach for the two people she was talking about, and just as I sat up, we both watched as the two figures started walking directly toward us. As they got closer, I could see them more clearly. One of them was an objectively beautiful girl, but she looked very off for some reason. She had wild curly hair, and from what I could see of her eyes in the moonlight, they looked incredibly dark and vacant. She was wearing a simple beach cover-up over her bathing suit, and she was walking hand in hand with a man. I assumed it was her boyfriend because she was holding his hand in a very loving way, almost leaning her body weight against his arm as they walked. He was a tall man with a huge thick beard and long brown hair that was pulled back into a messy bun. He was wearing a red flannel shirt that was completely unbuttoned with no shirt underneath, and just plain bathing suit shorts. Even though it was nighttime, it was still very warm outside, so wearing a heavy flannel shirt seemed extremely out of place. Once they finally reached our towel, they did not say anything. They just stood there, standing uncomfortably close to us. Because Ally and I were basically still laying down on the sand, they were literally standing right over us, looking down. Both of them just stood there, staring at us, wearing these wide, empty smiles for absolutely no reason that I could think of. Finally, Ally got annoyed, sat up, and asked if we could help them with something. The woman, still wearing that wide, creepy smile, spoke in a very slow, soft voice, and said that the two of us were quite beautiful, you know. I was completely speechless, and at a total loss for words. My girlfriend, however, just looked at them and said thanks, and then told them that they could leave us alone now. Allie is definitely someone who is not afraid to speak her mind. Maybe it is the tough nurse mentality in her, but she does not take any crap from anyone. The smiling woman slowly looked at me, then looked back at Ally, and said in a deeply haunting voice, "No thank you." And all while this was happening, she just continued to smile that vacant smile. Her boyfriend stood next to her, completely stiff and motionless, but still smiling down at us. After a brief silent moment, another couple suddenly walked over from the shadows. It was very late, so there were barely any other people around on the beach. At first, I thought this new couple might be coming over to help us, because I was sure our body language made it obvious that we were uncomfortable. I could not have been more wrong. This second couple walked right up to us, and just like the first two, stood directly over us on the sand. And just like the others, both of them were wearing those exact same unsettling smiles. This new woman also had a beach cover-up on, but she was sporting these pigtails in her hair that were not even close to being symmetrical. Her boyfriend had really curly, shaggy-looking hair. The first woman looked up at them, pointed at us, and said, "Look, a new couple. I honestly did not know if we were being pranked by some weird locals, or if this was actually real life." I know they had not done anything physically threatening to us yet, but my internal alarm bells were screaming at maximum volume. Nobody stands that close to complete strangers in the dark unless they are up to something bad. The unsettling smiles and their frozen, stoic posture just felt incredibly dangerous. I was getting extremely unsettled, and these four people just kept inching closer and closer to where Ally and I were sitting on the towel. They had gotten so close now that the one girl's bare foot was actually touching my leg. I could tell that Ally had officially hit her breaking point, and I was trying to think of what to do. I finally stood up, stepped directly in front of one of the guys, and told him to take one more step and see what happens. I thought that if I stood up and confronted them, they might back off. I am a pretty big guy physically, but I am not very intimidating. Allie always joked that I was just a lovable teddy bear, which is not exactly the kind of person who inspires fear in others. Instead of backing away, all four of these beach lunatics just started laughing. I felt angry and annoyed, but for a split second, I almost felt comforted by their laughter. I thought that maybe the laugh was proof that this was all just some elaborate joke. But once again, I was dead wrong. While the others continued to laugh, one of the guys suddenly lunged forward at me. I had absolutely no time to defend myself. Both of the men immediately started to beat me up, throwing punches, and I could not do anything to stop them. I was knocked down onto the sand, just trying my best to cover my face and praying that the engagement ring did not fall out of my pocket. While they were hitting me, I could hear Ally screaming at the top of her lungs, but the two girls just stood there and laughed at her. Ally tried to intervene and pull the men off me, but the second girl stepped in and pushed her hard back down onto the sand. The two men then grabbed me, picked me up, and slammed me down hard into the sand right next to Ally. In the blink of an eye, all of their creepy smiles suddenly vanished, turning into faces of pure, intense anger. One of the men started to fumble his way through an inside pocket of his red flannel shirt. Even though I could not see what he was grabbing, I knew in my gut he was looking for a pocket knife or some other kind of weapon. In that moment of sheer panic, something came over me. I do not know if it was pure adrenaline or fight or flight, but I raised my leg and kicked the ankle of one of the girls as hard as I could since she was still standing right next to my head. It was a solid, heavy kick, and she stumbled backward in the sand. Her stumbling instantly distracted the other three for a brief second. In that split second of distraction, I grabbed Ally's hand, scrambled to my feet, and we ran as fast as we possibly could back toward our resort. I could feel warm blood dripping down my face, and my ribs were absolutely killing me. I looked back over my shoulder just once as we were running, and I saw the two couples just standing there on the beach, watching us run. They were not even trying to chase us. We finally made it back to our resort room, slammed the doors shut, locked all the deadbolts, and turned off every single light. It was a horrible, paranoid night. I still do not know why, but we decided not to call the police. Obviously, in hindsight, we absolutely should have contacted the authorities right away, but in that moment of pure terror, we were just so afraid of drawing any attention to our location. The next morning, we checked out of the resort incredibly early so we could start the long drive back home. The entire time we were loading our suitcases into the car and checking out at the desk, we kept looking over our shoulders. Every single person we saw out of the corner of our eye, we immediately assumed was one of those beach couples. We did not want to risk running into those mysterious strangers ever again. As we were finally driving out of the hotel parking lot, we saw the two girls standing on the corner of the street just a block away. They did not seem to see us at first. We did not know what to do, but we had to drive past that exact corner to get onto the highway. As we slowly drove past them, both of the girls suddenly turned their heads and noticed us in the car. They both smiled widely and waved at us friendly, as if we were old friends. Once we finally hit the highway and got some distance, Ally called the resort and informed them about what had happened on the beach. They apologized and said they would look into the matter, but I am not sure if anything was ever actually done about it. I realize that this might not be your typical scary ghost story, but to me it was so much worse. We are incredibly lucky that we managed to get out of there without any life-threatening physical injuries. Unfortunately, the memory of that horrible night and the terrifying people on that beach will stay with me for the rest of my life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This first story happened back when I was really young, and when I say young, I am talking about the time when I was in either the 2nd or the 3rd grade. It is honestly pretty hard for me to remember things clearly from that long ago, as most of my childhood memories from that period of my life have faded into a sort of general warm blur. But this one particular memory stands out in incredibly sharp, vivid detail, and it does so for reasons that you will very soon understand. It was a typical, ordinary school day in the middle of the week, and it had been raining cats and dogs since the early morning hours before I even woke up. The sky was a dark, heavy, oppressive shade of gray, and the water was pooling in massive puddles all over the school playground, which meant that the teachers had to keep us inside the classroom for recess. After the school bus dropped me off and I walked up our driveway, my parents immediately started getting ready to go out for the evening. They were leaving the house to attend some kind of highly upscale, formal event. I cannot remember now if it was a high society charity fundraiser, a fancy business dinner party, or something else entirely. Either way, they were dressed up in their absolute nicest clothes. My father was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit with a silk tie, and my mother was wearing a long, sparkling evening gown with her best jewelry. They were supposed to come back home to tuck me in that very night, but while they were gone, the storm decided to pick up like crazy. It turned from a steady, annoying rain into a full-on torrential downpour, and the wind began howling furiously through the tall trees outside our house. It quickly became completely unsafe to drive long distances, especially on the winding, poorly lit and flooded roads that led back to our quiet suburban neighborhood. So, instead of trying to make the highly treacherous drive back home to me, my parents reluctantly decided that the safest option was to spend the night at one of their close friends' houses. This friend happened to live much closer to where the formal event was being held, which made a lot of sense from a logical standpoint. I remember the exact moment the landline phone in our kitchen started ringing. The sound echoed through the quiet house, and I ran over to the counter to answer it. It was my mom on the other end of the line. She sounded incredibly apologetic, and she kept repeatedly saying how sorry she was for leaving me there all by myself in the dark. She sounded genuinely stressed out and worried about the whole situation. Even though I was quite young, I insisted that I was totally fine, that I was not even hungry, and that she did not need to worry about me at all. My mom, trying to calm her own nerves and make sure I would be safe, gave me a very specific, detailed list of things to do before I went to sleep. She told me to go check the front door and the back door to make sure they were locked. She told me to make sure every single window in the entire house was shut tight. She told me to keep at least one light on in the hallway so the house did not look completely dark and empty from the side. And finally, she told me to make sure all the blinds on the windows were fully closed. It was typical, standard safety stuff that any caring parent would tell their young kid. At the time, I did not really understand why they were making such a huge deal out of everything. I was not quite old enough to realize how dangerous it could actually be to leave a kid of my age entirely home alone overnight in the middle of a massive raging storm. In fact, to be completely honest with you, I was actually kind of excited to have the entire place to myself. To a second or third grader, being left alone in the house felt like a massive once-in-a-lifetime adventure. It meant I had completely unlimited access to the kitchen candy drawer, and more importantly, it meant there was absolutely no set bedtime. I obviously did not have a television, a computer, or any kind of screen in my personal bedroom at that age, so I decided to stay downstairs in the family living room. I set myself up on the big comfortable couch, wrapped myself in a warm blanket, and turned on the main television. I told myself that I would do all of those boring safety chores my mom had requested right before I went to sleep, since I was fully planning on staying up all night anyway. I wanted to milk this newfound freedom for everything it was worth. But, as you can probably guess, at some point later in the night, the massive sugar crash from all the candy I had eaten finally got to me. My eyes started getting incredibly heavy, and I accidentally fell fast asleep right there on the couch. There was no real surprise there, as a kid can only stay awake for so long on a diet of pure sugar. I do not remember exactly what time it was when I ended up waking up, but it was definitely very late. It was late enough for the television screen to have gone completely black and entered its automatic power-saving sleep mode, which meant at least 3 hours had passed since I first fell asleep. I distinctly remember feeling a lot colder the very moment I opened my eyes. Now, waking up a bit chilly in the middle of the night is not usually anything too out of the ordinary. I mean, everyone knows that temperatures naturally drop during the late night hours. But this particular difference in temperature was so incredibly significant that it made me instantly make a connection. Even at that young age, the chill in the air felt active and cold, like there was a physical draft moving through the house. I thought about just pulling the blanket over my head, curling back up, and going right back to sleep. But then, like a sudden jolt of electricity, I remembered the list of chores my mom had given me on the phone. Even at that young age, I knew she would somehow find out if I had ignored her strict instructions, and I really, truly did not want to get in trouble after she had trusted me enough to stay home alone. So, with a lot of reluctance, I forced myself off the warm couch and went to go check the windows and doors. I walked through the dark, quiet house, turning on a few light switches to guide my way. I went around and did absolutely everything she had asked me to do. I locked the front door, making sure the heavy metal deadbolt clicked firmly into place. I went to the back kitchen door and slid the lock shut there too. I walked around the entire first floor, closing all the plastic blinds and checking every single window to make sure they were fully secured. I even kept one of the hallway lights turned on, just like she had instructed me to do. Everything was shut tight and locked up, which actually confused me quite a bit. It confused me because the inside of the house still felt way colder than it should have. The chill was persistent and deep. I even went as far as putting my bare hand flat against a couple of the glass window panes, just to make sure they were not cracked open or letting a draft in. But they were all sealed perfectly shut. I figured that maybe the severe storm outside had somehow knocked out the house heating system, or maybe the furnace was just acting up. I did not think much more about it beyond that. That simple explanation seemed to make perfect sense to me at the time, and I was honestly just so incredibly tired that I could not devote any more of my limited energy to thinking about the heating system. So, with my chores finally finished, I headed upstairs to my bedroom, fully ready to crawl into my own bed and forget about the cold. But when I got to the top of the stairs and walked into my room, I finally realized just how bad the storm outside had actually gotten. Our downstairs living room is tucked away in the very center of the house, surrounded by other thick walls. So I had not really been able to fully appreciate the intensity of the weather from down there. But my childhood bedroom, on the other hand, had a very large window that faced directly out toward the front yard. Because of that, I could hear everything in loud, clear detail. The rain was slamming against the glass pane with so much force that it sounded like it was actively trying to break its way inside the room. And every minute or so, there would be a massive, blinding burst of lightning that lit up the entire room like daytime, followed almost instantly by a deafening, house-shaking clash of thunder. I was not typically a kid who was easily scared of storms at that age, but I do remember lying there, feeling a bit concerned that a large tree branch might break off and crash through the roof. That worry is probably why I had such a hard time falling back asleep, even though I had been absolutely dead tired not even 20 minutes prior. As I was lying there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling and trying to force my mind to quiet down, I started picking up on some very odd sounds. Every so often, in the brief silences between the wind howling and the rain hitting the glass, I could hear these weird, slow creaking sounds. It sounded exactly like shifting wood. The major problem with this was that the entire floor of my bedroom, and indeed the entire upstairs hallway, was fully carpeted. There was absolutely no exposed hardwood anywhere near my room, so there was no logical way that creaking sound could have been coming from my floorboards. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a tree branch outside, swaying in the wind and rubbing against the side of the house. But the quality of the sound did not quite fit that explanation. Even back then, I knew the general, familiar sounds that were associated with a typical thunderstorm. This creaking sound was definitely not one of them. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, and too close. It started really bothering me after a while. For whatever reason, it was no longer the loud storm that was keeping me awake. It was that stupid, persistent creaking sound. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, until I simply could not take it any longer. So, I sat up in my bed and looked around the dark room, not really sure what I was actually looking for. I strained my ears, doing my best to drown out the loud sounds of the storm so I could focus in on where the creaking was coming from. Just then, a bright flash of lightning illuminated the entire room for a split second. Everything looked completely normal. My desk, my toys, my chair, everything was right where it belonged, but my eyes were naturally drawn to the only wooden object in the entire room, my closet. The room went pitch black again, and I sat there in the darkness, perfectly still, barely even daring to breathe. About a minute later, another flash of lightning lit up the room once again. It was only bright for a split second, but in that split second, I saw something that made me freeze and almost choke on my own breath. The closet door, which was made of solid wood and had been firmly shut, was now standing slightly ajar. I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that it had been fully closed before I went to bed. I was 100% sure of it. I always closed my closet door before going to sleep because the dark opening freaked me out. Something had opened it while I was lying in bed. There was something or someone inside my room. I did not scream. I did not speak a single word. I did not even let myself think about what might happen next. I just slid out from under my covers as quietly as I possibly could, placed my bare feet on the carpet, and walked out of the room. That short walk from my bed to the bedroom door felt like a 500-mile journey that took 5 years to complete. Every muscle in my body was tense, expecting a hand to reach out from the dark closet and grab me. But I made it to the hallway. I immediately ran downstairs, trying to make as little noise as possible, and I scrambled under the dining room table. I pulled my knees up to my chest and hid behind the heavy wooden chairs. Then, and only then, did I finally start to cry. I cried silently, tears streaming down my face as I tried to muffle my heavy breathing. I did not know what else to do. There was someone inside my house, someone who had been hiding in my bedroom closet, and my parents were too far away to help me. I had no phone downstairs, no way to call for help, and I was entirely on my own. I am not sure exactly how long I stayed huddled under that dining room table. It felt like hours, but it might have only been 20 minutes. But at one point, above the sound of the rain, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps walking down the wooden stairs. I instantly held my breath, knowing with absolute certainty that any single sound I made could end my life. But these were not normal, steady footsteps. It sounded like whatever was coming down the stairs was stumbling, jumping, and almost pinballing off the walls as it made its way down. The footsteps grew louder and closer. They were moving through the hallway, approaching the dining room. They were coming directly toward the table, almost as if they knew exactly where I was hiding. I cannot even begin to describe how terrified I was in that moment. My heart was beating so hard I was convinced the intruder would hear it. I truly, honestly thought I was going to die, and then, looking out from my hiding spot under the table, I saw them. Because of the hanging tablecloth and the chairs, I could not see their upper body. But 2 bare feet walked directly into my field of view. They were followed by 2 nasty, wet, and incredibly muddy legs that had a strange, sickening yellow tint to them. I could not tell if they were the legs of a man or a woman. That was how gross, dirty, and almost disfigured they looked. There were deep cuts and scratches all over the skin, looking as if this person had just rolled around in a thick, thorny bush. They were also stumbling badly, swaying back and forth, as if they were struggling to even stand upright on their own feet. And just as I thought the situation could not possibly get any worse, the person dropped something. It was a heavy metal wrench. It slipped from their hand and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor, rolling a few inches. I am telling you, it took every single fiber of my being, every ounce of strength I had, to fight back a scream. If that person bent down to pick the wrench up, they would have looked directly under the table and seen me hiding there. With wide, terrified eyes, I watched as the person stood perfectly still. They did not bend down to pick up the wrench, but they did not walk away either. They just stood there, swaying slightly. It felt like a tense, silent standoff where any wrong move or sound from me would end my life. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they finally started walking again, moving away from the table until they were out of my sight. I listened closely as those chaotic, stumbling footsteps stomped around the rooms of my first floor for a long time. And then finally, I heard the sound of the front door opening and shutting. They were gone. I stayed hidden under that dining room table for a very long time after the door closed. Part of it was sheer fear, but another part of it was what I can only describe as immediate trauma. I was just completely shaken, numb, and terrified. I was at that ripe age where I fully understood just how dangerous the situation was. But I was not nearly old enough to know how to actually deal with it or process it. The rest of that night is honestly a bit of a blur. At some point, I crawled out from under the table. I saw the heavy metal wrench lying on the floor. I picked it up, not wanting my parents to find it the next morning and ask questions. After making sure the front door was actually locked this time, I slunk back upstairs, crawled into my bed, and somehow fell asleep. Everything went back to normal after that night. For whatever reason, I was absolutely terrified to tell my parents what had happened. I was so afraid that they would find out I had fallen asleep on the couch and had not locked the doors and checked the windows immediately like they had asked me to do. I thought I would get in massive trouble for being irresponsible. So, I kept the entire terrifying experience completely to myself. It was not until several years later, when I was much older, that I finally decided to tell them the story. And to be honest, it actually took a lot of convincing for them to even believe me. They thought I was just making up a wild story or remembering a bad dream. Looking back, my decision to not tell them the very moment it happened was an awful, terrible decision. Since so much time had passed, there was absolutely nothing the police or my parents could do about it. If I am being completely frank, this entire experience traumatized me for basically the rest of my childhood. From that night on, I absolutely had to sleep with a bright nightlight in my room, and I developed a severe fear of the dark that did not go away for a very long time. I still have trouble explaining exactly what happened that night, or who that person was, but I learned a very valuable lesson. Always lock your doors at night. Now, this second story is something that unfolded over the course of about 3 or 4 long years when I was just a young kid growing up in our family home. I cannot remember the exact year or even how old I was when I experienced the very first episode, but I started having this highly specific, recurring, half-lucid nightmare. This was not a dream that occurred every night, but rather once every couple of months, creeping up on me when I least expected it. From what I can still remember with absolute clarity, here is exactly how that dream would go. I would be lying down in my bed, only the view of my room was not from my own first-person perspective. Instead, I would be looking down at myself from the high ceiling, almost as if I were viewing my own bedroom through some kind of security camera feed. That strange out-of-body dissociation always freaked me out immediately. I would try as hard as I could to float or swim back down toward my own physical body lying below, but I was never able to move at all. The only thing I could do was slowly swivel my head around to look at the rest of my room from that high vantage point. Because I was half lucid, I knew deep down that it was just a dream, but that realization did not make me feel any less scared. After forcing myself to calm down a bit, I would start to notice some very strange, incorrect details about my bedroom. For one thing, the bright red digital clock sitting on my nightstand would always be rapidly counting the time in reverse. That was typically the very first strange detail I would notice. And once I noticed the clock, I would start seeing other weird things. There were these strange, colorful drawings taped to random spots all over my walls and my wooden dresser. They looked like the kind of crayon drawings you would expect from a kid of my age, but I had absolutely no memory of ever drawing them. I was never the type of kid who liked to draw or do arts and crafts, so it was not like I had just made them and forgotten about them. These drawings always depicted the exact same scene. It was a row of stick figure people holding hands, all of them wearing huge, creepy smiles. In the middle of them was one smaller figure, who I can only imagine was supposed to represent me. They were all standing directly in front of a large house that had a bright blue roof. I cannot remember much more about the drawings than that, but they felt deeply unsettling and out of place. The other detail about these dreams that still sticks out to me to this day is an old toy train of mine. In the dream, this toy train was always sitting in a different spot on my bedroom floor. This was highly significant because I had actually lost that exact toy train in real life several years prior, and it had never been found despite my parents searching everywhere. Anyway, after spending a bit of time analyzing my room and noticing these details, I would always get this sudden, unexplainable urge to look out of my bedroom window. I would slowly glance over toward the glass, and as if it were on complete cue, a man would suddenly appear standing just a few inches away from the pane on the outside. He had short gray hair, and there was a very noticeable fresh-looking cut on his left temple. To be honest, that cut is the only detail about his face that I can remember clearly. He would stand there, perfectly still, watching me sleep for a few seconds. Then he would suddenly start clawing frantically at the window glass, scratching his fingernails against it, as if he were trying to force it open from the outside. That clawing sound is usually when I would wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes, the moment I woke up, I would immediately run over to the window to check. Other times, I was simply too terrified to move a single muscle. But I always ended up checking the window pane one way or another. I do not really know what I expected to find. Maybe some deep claw marks in the wood or a greasy handprint on the glass, but there was never anything there. There was never anyone outside. After this exact dream happened for the 4th time, I finally decided to tell my parents about it. My mom listened patiently and told me that recurring dreams were actually not that rare, especially for kids my age who have active imaginations. My dad chimed in to gently remind me that they were always sleeping just one room down the hallway, and that I could always come get them if I ever felt scared. I nodded my head and acted like their words helped me, but they did not. Not really. My dad could easily tell that I was still feeling incredibly anxious, so he decided to take me by the hand and explore the outside of the house with me. We walked all around the exterior, checking the ground directly underneath my bedroom window. There was absolutely no indication that anyone had ever been standing there. There were no footprints in the dirt, no smudges on the glass, nothing at all. Even so, that did not calm my nerves as much as you might think. Keep in mind, this was about a year into the whole ordeal, so I was having this exact dream roughly once every 3 months. It was not happening every single night, not even close, but having the exact same highly detailed dream 4 times in a row definitely felt like it meant something. I knew that even at my young age. But after that 4th dream and the talk with my parents, the nightmare suddenly stopped. For a while at least. I went nearly 6 whole months without having a single episode, and at some point during that peaceful stretch, I let myself believe that it was finally over. The fear just kind of faded into the background of my mind, the way childhood fears usually do when life gets busy and normal again. But then, without warning, it came back. I have absolutely no idea what triggered it, but on one random night, I had the dream all over again. Everything in the dream was exactly the same as I remembered. The reverse clock, the creepy drawings, the toy train, everything. But there was one new detail about this particular dream that was scaring me twice as much as the earlier ones had. At first, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Everything seemed to be following the exact same familiar chain of events. But then, as I was looking around the room from my ceiling perspective, I realized what the difference was. My bedroom window was standing wide open. As soon as I saw that open window, I shocked myself awake. But this time, I could not move. There was a period of maybe 5 whole minutes where I was experiencing complete and utter sleep paralysis. My brain was actively screaming at me to get up and check the window, but I could not drag my heavy limbs out of bed no matter how hard I tried. On top of that, I felt significantly colder in real life, as if a stream of freezing night air was actively blowing across my bed from my window, which I was convinced was wide open. Those 5 minutes were unlike any kind of pure fear I have ever experienced in my entire life. All I could think about was how that gray-haired man was probably moments away from climbing through my open window, yet there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop him. When I finally regained control of my body, I forced myself out of bed and rushed to the window. It was closed and locked. I could not fall back asleep for the rest of that night. I was just too terrified. Another couple of months went by, but I was determined not to be caught off guard again. Every single night before I went to bed, I would lie in bed and think long and hard about the dream. I did this in an attempt to brace my mind for having it again. I was hoping that by keeping the dream fresh in my thoughts, I would not get as scared if it happened again. To my surprise, that mental technique actually worked. The next time I had the dream, I was not even half as scared as before. I did not even bother checking the window after I woke up. By the time I had it again after that, I was barely scared at all. Still, something about the dream lingered in my mind. It was not in a scary way anymore, but it was enough to make me want to bring it up to my parents one more time. Maybe it was the way I explained it, or maybe it was because I was slightly older and could articulate things better. But for whatever reason, they actually paid much closer attention this time. I tried to provide as much detail as possible, describing the drawings in the room, but as I got to the description of the gray-haired man, I noticed my parents' demeanor shift. It was not a dramatic change, but it was enough for me to notice. Specifically, it happened right as I was telling them about the distinct cut on his forehead temple. Before I could even finish my sentence, my dad suddenly cut me off. He asked me if I was absolutely sure about the cut on his head. I told him I was completely sure, and he immediately looked over at my mom. They shared this silent, knowing look, like there was some deep, unspoken secret that I was not aware of. I asked them what was going on, but they quickly assured me that everything was fine and that I did not need to worry. Not wanting to upset them, I did not ask any more questions. But from that point on, I started wondering if there was a lot more to this story than they were letting on. As it would turn out, a few days after that conversation, my parents sat me down in the living room. My mom did most of the talking. She explained that when I was really little, way too young to even form memories. There was a man named Brian who used to watch me sometimes. They always referred to him as Uncle Brian, but he was not actually related to us. He was just a very close friend of my dad's from college. I guess he was around our house a lot when I was a baby and a toddler, especially during the times when both of my parents were working full-time jobs. But then, something happened. My dad did not give me any specific details, but he said there was a massive falling out between them. It was bad enough that they completely cut all ties with him. He said he had strictly forbidden Brian from ever coming near our family, and specifically from ever coming near me again. That was supposed to be the end of it. I asked my parents what had caused the major fallout, but they refused to tell me. They just repeated that it had nothing to do with me and that I was safe. But the only other thing they did tell me, and this is what gave me a deep sick feeling in my stomach, was that Brian had a very noticeable scar on his forehead from a serious car accident he had been in years before I was even born. They did not connect the dots out loud for me, but they did not have to. I was old enough to make the connection myself. Later night, my dad lingered in the living room with me. I could tell he wanted to say more. After a few moments of silence, he told me his personal theory. He said he thought these recurring dreams were just my brain's way of processing a memory that was buried incredibly deep in my subconscious. Some memory from when I was a toddler. He mentioned how close I apparently used to be with Brian, how I would cry whenever he left the house, and how I always wanted him to be the one to read me bedtime stories. My dad said he could not think of any other way I would have known about the specific scar on Brian's forehead. I did not know what to make of that. I had absolutely no conscious memory of this Brian person whatsoever. I had no choice but to try and move on with my life. Another handful of months passed by. The frequency of the dreams actually decreased significantly after that conversation. I only had the dream once or twice over the next year. But things took a very dark turn sometime in the 4th year. One night, after waking up from the familiar dream, I glanced over at my real bedroom window just out of habit. And this time, I actually saw something move in the darkness outside. It was just a brief flicker, but I was 100% sure that someone had just darted away from my window. All the fear I had spent years trying to conquer came rushing back in an instant. I jumped out of bed and screamed for my parents. My dad immediately sprinted outside into the yard in his bare feet, while my mom held me tightly in the hallway. When my dad came back inside, he was whispering to my mom in a very serious tone. They told me to stay in their room while they called the police. I listened to them, though I do not remember ever hearing any sirens that night. The next day, my dad confessed to me that he had found extremely faint footprints in the damp dirt directly underneath my bedroom window. I asked him if he thought it was Brian, but he insisted that was impossible because we had moved to a new house since then, and Brian did not know our new address. My dad promised me that nothing bad was ever going to happen, and he turned out to be right. I never had that dream again. My parents still do not like talking about it, and I can see why. What I still cannot wrap my head around is the sickening thought that maybe, just maybe, every single time I had that dream, there really was someone standing outside my window watching me sleep. Was it really possible that someone had been stalking me for 4 years, and my brain was picking up on it? I still do not know, and I cannot decide which option is scarier. This third story happened a decent while ago, back when I was finishing up middle school. It was the absolute last day of the 8th grade. It was exactly the kind of day you would expect, filled with excitement, high energy, and bittersweet goodbyes. Everyone was running around the hallways, scribbling silly signatures and cheesy messages in each other's brand new yearbooks. My middle school was massive, with easily over 1,000 students in total. So, to keep things organized, the teachers decided to collect all of our yearbooks and pass them around to different classrooms so that everyone got a chance to sign them. You can probably see how that setup could easily create some major problems. Anyone who wanted to could write absolutely anything they wanted in anyone's book without being seen. The teachers tried their best to monitor things, but I knew of several kids who received some really mean anonymous messages. At the very end of the school day, when I finally got my yearbook back, I flipped through the glossy pages eagerly, reading all the funny notes from my close friends. But as I was scanning the pages, one specific message caught my eye. It was written directly below the portrait of a kid I had never seen before in my life. His name was printed as Samuel Robinson III. The message he had written to me was short, simple, and honestly a bit unsettling. It said, "Hags, I will be seeing you again." I stared at the page, completely confused. I had never spoken a single word to this Samuel kid. I did not even know what grade he was in. But there was nothing I could do about it then, as the school year was officially over. I just chalked it up to some weird kid being strange, or maybe he had signed my book by mistake thinking it belonged to someone else. Either way, I closed the book and stopped thinking about it. A few hours passed, and before I knew it, I was back at my house, hosting a celebratory sleepover in my basement, with my best friends, Kevin, David, and Kieran. The four of us were eating snacks, laughing, and playing video games late into the night. My parents' bedroom was located 3 floors above the basement, so we did not have to worry at all about keeping our noise down. We were messing around, having a great time, when suddenly, just before 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard a sharp, loud knock at the basement storm door. The sound instantly silenced the entire room. Who would be knocking on a basement storm door at 2 in the morning? It had to be someone who knew we were down there. The person kept knocking, using a slow, rhythmic pattern. I could tell Kieran was about to say something, and I tried to stop him, but I was too late. In a loud, assertive voice, Kieran yelled out, "Who is there?" I wanted to knock him out right then and there. By shouting, he had basically broadcasted to whoever was outside that we were definitely inside and awake. After a long, tense pause with no more knocking, a muffled voice finally answered back. The voice said, "Come around to the back door." It was a high-pitched voice, and it sounded surprisingly cheerful and friendly, like it was just another kid from school trying to join our sleepover. It was definitely a teenager's voice. I was pretty scared, but my friends seemed completely unfazed. They actually thought it was exciting. They pressured me to go upstairs and check it out. We crept up the basement stairs as quietly as we could. I approached the back door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the narrow glass pane right next to the door, I could see a dark, shadowy figure standing under the dim light of the back porch. I got a little closer, and his face came into view. My jaw nearly hit the floor. It was him. It was the kid from the yearbook, Samuel Robinson III. My friends immediately reached to open the door, but I grabbed their arms and stopped them. I whispered to them that I knew who this kid was, and I quickly explained the weird yearbook signature. That instantly changed their mood. They realized this was not a normal situation. Sam was still standing outside, and he could clearly see us through the glass. He noticed how freaked out I was, and he started motioning with his hand, pointing toward the side of the house, indicating he wanted me to go over to the kitchen window. I did not want to open the back door, but I decided to go over to the kitchen window and crack it open just a tiny bit so I could find out what he wanted. My friend stood just behind me. Sam walked over to the open crack in the window, and I asked him what he wanted, telling him that I knew who he was because of the yearbook. He smiled and said, "Oh, so you got my message." He then went on to say that he had always watched me from afar at school, and that he thought we could have been really good friends. I just nodded and agreed with him, wanting to keep him calm, but there was absolutely zero chance I would ever be friends with him. Before I could say anything else to try and get him to leave, David suddenly leaned forward and called him a creepy stalker, telling him to get lost. Sam's friendly smile disappeared in an instant. He tilted his head slowly, as if he did not understand what David had just said. Then his face twisted into an expression of pure, intense hatred. He went from being quiet and passive to incredibly aggressive. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling about how he hated my friends, how we should all die, and bringing up random, personal details about my life that he had absolutely no right knowing. He reached his hand through the small gap in the window and tried to force it open, but I slammed the window shut and locked it. He started snarling like an animal, banging his fists violently against the glass. He was seconds away from shattering it completely. The noise was so loud that my parents came rushing downstairs to see what was going on. The moment they turned on the outdoor floodlights, Sam turned and sprinted away into the dark yard. I explained everything to my parents and my dad ran outside to search, but Sam was already gone. The next morning, my parents contacted the school administration. That is when we learned the most disturbing detail of all. Sam had actually been expelled from our school several weeks before the year ended, and he was strictly banned from being on school property. The only reason his photo was still in the yearbook was because they had already been printed before his expulsion. That meant he had actively snuck back into the school building on the very last day of class just to find my yearbook and write me that creepy message. Despite my parents and the school working together, nobody could seem to track down Sam or his family. It was like they had completely vanished. To this day, I still have absolutely no idea how he found out where I lived. That is the detail that still keeps me up at night. This fourth story happened a decent while ago, back when I was 22 years old. Enough years have passed now that I feel completely safe talking about it. I was fresh out of college, holding a great new job with very minimal living expenses, because I was living back in my childhood home with my parents. It was a pretty sweet setup, allowing me to save up a massive amount of money while enjoying all the comforts of my hometown. I knew how lucky I was, and I never took it for granted. But not everything during this time was as stress-free as it seemed. What I am about to tell you happened during my very first month of being back at home. I have never been much of a party person. I do not drink heavily, I do not go to clubs, and I definitely do not let random guys dictate how I live my life. My father is the most important role model to me, and I have always preferred a quiet, routine lifestyle. My days consisted of getting coffee, going to work, hitting the gym, reading, and sleeping. But one weekend, my close friend from college, Lindsay, invited me and our other two friends, Sabrina and Thea, to spend a few days at her family's beach house. Lindsay's parents are incredibly wealthy neurosurgeons, so I knew the house would be amazing. And when I arrived, I was absolutely stunned. It was an ultra-modern, massive house that looked more like a secure, high-tech fortress than a beach home. The four of us decided to all sleep in the same room, which had 2 sets of bunk beds, because we thought it would be more fun that way. On our first night there, we wanted to keep things pretty relaxed. We walked down to the private, quiet beach directly behind the house, sat in the sand, and started stargazing while listening to music. As we were sitting there, we noticed a faint flickering light far down the shoreline. We watched as the light swung back and forth, realizing it was a flashlight held by someone walking in our direction. Soon we could hear the sound of laughter, which made us relax a bit. It was a group of 3 guys who looked to be around our age. As they got closer, one of them called out a friendly greeting. Thea, who was always very outgoing, yelled back, and the guys came over to join us. They had the typical beach boy look, and they were very friendly. We sat in the sand, talking and drinking for about an hour. Eventually, the guys invited us back to the house they were staying at just a bit further down the beach. I was feeling exhausted and had no interest in going, but my 3 friends really wanted to keep hanging out. I decided not to be a party pooper, so I told them to go ahead without me, and I walked back to Lindsay's house to go to sleep. Sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was suddenly awoken by my phone ringing. It was a FaceTime call from Lindsay, I answered, and she was screaming into the camera, telling me that Sabrina and Thea had just been kidnapped and that I needed to get into her car immediately. The panic I felt was like ice water in my veins. I sprinted downstairs, grabbed her keys, and drove out of the driveway in a matter of seconds. Lindsay stayed on the phone with me, explaining that she had already called the police. She told me the guys had put the girls into a dark SUV and headed down the main road. I slammed on the gas, driving at an incredibly dangerous speed to try and catch up. After a few minutes, I spotted a vehicle matching her description, driving slowly ahead of me. I kept my distance, called the police to give them our exact location, and followed them. Within minutes, several police cruisers sped past me with their lights flashing. They forced the SUV to pull over, and officers approached the vehicle with their weapons drawn. They dragged the 3 men out of the car, slammed them onto the ground, and put them in handcuffs. One of the officers then rushed to the back of the SUV and popped the trunk open. Inside, both Thea and Sabrina were tied up, terrified, and covered in bruises. The details of what had happened after I left were horrifying. While they were at the guys' house, things had seemed fine at first. But when it was time to leave, one of the guys got incredibly angry when Lindsay refused his advances. She left, but realized she had forgotten her purse and turned back to get it. That is when she witnessed the men violently forcing the other 2 girls into the trunk of their car. If she had not gone back, or if I had not been able to get the car and follow them so quickly, the police might have never caught up to them in time. It turned out those 3 men did not even own the beach house they were staying in. They were actually squatting in a vacant home belonging to an elderly couple who were out of the country. They were charged with kidnapping, burglary, assault, and a list of other serious crimes, and they were sent to prison for a very long time. This 5th story happened just last year, and it involves my best friend Jimmy. Jimmy is highly connected within the electronic music scene on the East Coast, specifically around New York and New Jersey. His company hosts massive music events at high-profile venues, bringing in very famous DJs to perform. Because Jimmy and I have been best friends for over 20 years, he always lets me and our hometown friends come to his shows for free and hang out in the exclusive VIP areas. Last year, over the 4th of July weekend, Jimmy was hosting his biggest event yet at a popular venue right on the Jersey Shore. He invited me and our friend Ryan to come down early, so we made the drive and arrived at the venue several hours before the doors opened. Since we had nothing to do while the crew set up, Ryan and I decided to take full advantage of the free alcohol offered to us. By the time the event officially started, we were already heavily buzzed. As the night went on, we drank even more, eventually becoming completely wasted. As the party was winding down, Ryan and I went over to the bar to get one last drink. While we were standing there, we started talking to 2 attractive girls who introduced themselves as Gianna and Marcella. They seemed very wealthy, based on how they were dressed, and they were incredibly friendly. After a bit of conversation, Marcella suggested that we all leave the crowded venue and continue the party at her beach house, which she claimed was just a short walk away. Ryan and I agreed, and before we left, Gianna handed us each a drink to finish. We downed the drinks and began walking along the beach toward her house. As we walked, I noticed that I was suddenly starting to feel incredibly strange. It was not a normal drunk feeling. My body felt incredibly heavy, like my limbs were turning to cardboard, and I was struggling to keep my balance. But the feeling passed quickly, and we soon arrived at the house. The place was absolutely beautiful, filled with expensive sculptures and modern furniture. Within 15 minutes of getting inside, Ryan and Marcella disappeared into another room, leaving me alone in the living room with Gianna. She leaned in to kiss me, and that exact moment is the last thing I remember before blacking out completely. The next thing I remember is waking up with the hot sun shining directly on my face. I was lying in a patch of thick bushes, feeling incredibly disoriented and sick. When I tried to reach into my pockets for my phone and wallet, I realized they were completely gone. But the weirdest part was that I was not even wearing my own clothes. I was wearing a cheap, dirty t-shirt and shorts that belonged to a complete stranger. My shoes were still on my feet, but the shoelaces had been entirely removed and they were soaking wet. I stood up and looked around, realizing I was in a completely unfamiliar area that did not look like a beach town at all. I walked toward a nearby road and saw a 7-Eleven store across the street. I went inside and asked the cashier if I could use his phone, and I dialed my sister's number. She answered and told me she was actively tracking my phone's location. While I was on the phone, the front door of the store opened, and Ryan walked in. He looked just as confused and messed up as I did, and he was also wearing completely different clothes. We called the police and met them outside the store. We explained what had happened, but they seemed very skeptical, suggesting we had just gotten too drunk and lost our things. My sister then called back to say my phone was showing up in a parking lot just a few minutes away. The officers drove us there, and we found both of our phones sitting on the asphalt. The police refused to investigate any further, telling us to just find a ride home. When I checked my phone, I discovered several text messages had been sent from my number while I was blacked out. They were sent to my parents, Jimmy, and some other friends, letting them know I was safe and sleeping at a buddy's house. The messages sounded exactly like me, which was terrifying because I had absolutely no memory of writing them. Ryan and I later drove back to the beach to try and find the house Marcella had taken us to. We managed to locate it, and we knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, and when we asked if a girl named Marcella lived there, he told us he had lived there alone for 20 years and had no idea who she was. We realized those girls had likely drugged us, taken us to a vacant home, robbed us, changed our clothes for some bizarre reason, and dumped us an hour away. It was a deeply unsettling experience that we will never truly understand. The details of these events still haunt me to this day, leaving behind a deep sense of unease about the world and the people in it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. After breaking up with his first serious girlfriend when he was 21 years old, he found himself completely single for the first time in years. It was a massive lifestyle change that took a lot of getting used to. For a long time, his life had revolved around another person, and suddenly he had to figure out how to navigate the world alone. After about a year of self-reflection and adjustment, he decided it was finally time to put himself back out there and dive into the modern dating scene. Like most young adults in the digital age, he began downloading several different dating apps onto his phone. Out of all the apps he tried, OkCupid quickly became his favorite. He spent hours reading through profiles, hoping to find someone he could genuinely connect with. That was when he matched with a girl named Brenna. Looking at her profile, he felt an immediate spark. She had a wonderful biography that listed a lot of interests she shared with him, from her favorite music to her hobbies. On top of that, she was an exceptionally pretty, light-skinned black girl. They began messaging each other, and the conversation flowed incredibly well. They talked for several days, sharing stories and getting to know one another, until they both agreed it was time to meet up in person. The plan was simple. He would drive over to her house on the west side of town, pick her up, and they would head out to get some food together. He was filled with nervous excitement as he got into his car and drove across town. He pulled up to the curb in front of her house at exactly 6:30 in the evening. It was about 10 minutes after sunset, and the sky was rapidly darkening. The streetlights were starting to glow, casting long, eerie shadows across the quiet residential neighborhood. He put his car in park, picked up his phone, and sent Brenna a text message letting her know he had arrived. But she did not answer right away. He sat there in the silence of his car, staring at the screen, waiting for those little typing bubbles to appear. As the minutes ticked by, he started to feel a bit anxious, wondering if he was being stood up on his very first date after his long break. Finally, his phone buzzed with a notification. Brenna apologized for the delay, but explained that her brother was being extremely annoying and overprotective. She said her brother was insisting on walking outside to meet him before she was allowed to leave. He was frustrated. He texted back, expressing how much he did not want to deal with an overprotective family member on a first date. He just wanted a normal evening. But Brenna kept apologizing, saying her brother was forcing her hand and would not let her leave unless he met him first. Before he could type another response, the front door of the house opened. A large man stepped out onto the porch and began walking down the driveway, his eyes locked onto the car. He took a deep breath, opened his door, and stepped out onto the asphalt to meet him. As the man walked into the glow of the streetlights, he felt a sudden wave of unease. First of all, the man was absolutely massive, completely towering over him. Second, his skin was significantly darker than Brenna's. In fact, they did not look related in the slightest. Despite his growing discomfort, he put on a friendly face. The man reached out, shook his hand firmly, and introduced himself as Will. At first glance, there did not seem to be anything outwardly malicious about him. He seemed friendly enough, explaining that he just wanted to make sure his sister was going out with a trustworthy, stand-up guy. They stood in the driveway talking for a couple of minutes, and Will's behavior seemed perfectly normal. But then, Will made a request that changed everything. He asked him to step inside the house so he could meet Brenna in person before they left for their date. He hesitated, but he did not want to offend his date's family or seem rude, so he reluctantly agreed. He followed Will up the front steps and into the house. As soon as they stepped across the threshold, Will shut the heavy front door behind them, and the lock clicked into place. Will told him to wait right there in the living room while he went upstairs to fetch Brenna. As Will's footsteps faded up the stairs, he looked around the dimly lit living room, and his heart instantly sank. Sitting on the couch were two other men. Neither of them was smiling. They both turned their heads and stared at him with cold, predatory eyes. Trying to diffuse the thick tension in the room, he raised his hand and said, "What's up to them?" One of the men barely gave a slight nod. while the other remained completely motionless, his gaze locked onto him. Suddenly, Will's voice echoed down from the top of the stairs, saying he was trying to find Brenna. This made absolutely no sense. Why would he need to search for his sister in her own home? His survival instincts screamed at him to get out. He slowly turned his gaze toward the dining room adjacent to the living room. To his horror, there was a fourth man sitting silently at the dining table, staring at him. He knew he had to act immediately. Without turning his back on the three men in the room, he slowly took a step backward, reaching his hand out behind him for the front doorknob. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, one of the men on the couch leapt to his feet and screamed for the others to grab him. He did not waste a fraction of a second. He gripped the knob, flung the door open, and sprinted down the steps toward his car. Behind him, he could hear the heavy, frantic footsteps of the men giving chase. He scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it just as the first man reached the vehicle. For several agonizing seconds, the men surrounded his car, kicking the doors and violently punching the glass, trying to shatter the windows to get to him. He threw the car into drive and slammed his foot on the accelerator, tearing down the residential street. He drove straight home, bursting through the door out of breath and trembling. He told his parents what had happened, and they were deeply shocked. They urged him to contact the police. He reported the house and the terrifying incident immediately. Luckily, an anonymous neighbor had witnessed the attack on his car and vouched for his story. The police raided the home and arrested 3 of the 4 men, including the one who called himself Will. The fourth man was never caught, leaving him to wonder what dark fate those men had planned for him. Fast forward to his next dating app experience. He decided to try again but was far more cautious. After a couple of unsuccessful dates on Match.com, he wanted something casual, so he matched with a girl named Kylie on another app. She agreed to come over to his apartment to hang out. When she arrived, she was incredibly quiet. They hung out in his upstairs bedroom, watching television and talking. The conversation was incredibly awkward, filled with long silences. As the night went on, Kylie became completely emotionless. She stared blankly across the room and began talking slowly about very dark topics. Suddenly, she thanked him for letting her sleep over, assuming hanging out meant staying the night. Not wanting a conflict, he made a bed for her on the floor with blankets. She laid down, facing away from him, and he eventually fell asleep in the silence. In the middle of the night, he suddenly woke up. He looked down and saw the floor was empty. He turned on his lamp, but Kylie was nowhere to be found. Then he heard a low voice whispering downstairs. He quietly walked to the top of the stairs to listen. He could hear her muttering in a low tone. He went downstairs into the dark kitchen and saw Kylie sitting in a chair, staring directly at the blank wall, talking to herself. He whispered her name. She turned her head slowly, stared at him with empty eyes, and then turned back to the wall. Terrified, he ran back upstairs to his room and called his dad. On the 3rd call, his dad answered, advising him to call 911. Suddenly, he saw Kylie's thin silhouette standing in his bedroom doorway. She stood there for 10 seconds, then shrieked and charged at him in his bed. She lunged and wrapped her hands tightly around his throat, trying to choke him. He struggled violently against her grip, his chest tightening as her cold fingers pressed into his windpipe. Using his weight and adrenaline, he managed to twist his body, break her grip, and pin her down against the mattress. He screamed into his phone, begging his father to call the police immediately. After a frantic struggle, he managed to drag the thrashing, screaming girl down the stairs and push her out of the house, just as the police cruisers pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing against the walls. The officers quickly restrained Kylie and took her away to be processed. He was left sitting on his front steps, gasping for air and trembling, fully realizing that you should always meet people from dating apps in a safe, public place first. In February of 2014, another young man had a terrifying encounter on the app Badoo. He matched with a girl named Maria. Their conversation was going great, and he asked her to hang out that night. She agreed and asked for his address. He sent it to her and asked for her number, but she went offline. He waited for hours, but she never showed up, so he finally went to sleep. The next morning, he woke up at 6:30. He checked his phone and saw messages from Maria sent in the middle of the night. At 3 in the morning, she said she was coming. At 3:20, she said she was there. At 4, she said she was watching him. Then a new message popped up asking how he had slept. He typed back, asking who this was. The reply came instantly, telling him to check his closet. He looked over and saw his closet door, which had been shut, was now cracked open. As he watched, the door slowly creaked open further. He screamed for his father and bolted from the room. He realized his dad was away, but his older brother was home. They searched the closet, but it was empty. That was when they noticed the bedroom window was unlocked and open. The stalker had watched him sleep from the closet and slipped out. The police could not track the account without a court order, leaving him in fear. It was a terrifying reminder of the dangers of sharing your address online. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a quick check off the highway not too far away from where I live. It is the only thing open 24/7 in my rural middle-of-nowhere town. It is about a 25-minute drive if I am speeding, which I usually am. So, to translate for all you city folk, it is basically right next door. My sleep schedule is beyond atrocious, so I have been to that quick check more than a handful of times. I like to think I am pretty generic looking and nondescript, meaning I blend in well, but it would not surprise me if some of the late-night workers recognize me by now. This happened just last week, so most of the details are still painfully fresh in my mind. It was past midnight, and I was coding on my laptop. My productivity and focus peaked between the hours of 9 in the evening and 3 in the morning. So I was in that flow state that any hard worker craves. The screen of my laptop was the only light in my room, casting a soft blue glow over my keyboard as I typed line after line of code. The house was completely silent, and the only sound was the occasional tap of my fingers. The problem with late-night grinding is that you go from perfectly comfortable to dying of hunger in a matter of minutes, which is exactly what prompted me to shut things down and grab something to eat around the reasonable hour of 2 in the morning. Just so you have an understanding of everything, I should mention that the highway leading to the quick check is more of a local road than an interstate, so it is usually pretty dead. The ride there was relatively uneventful. I pulled into the quick check, ordered a sandwich from one of the counters, and roamed the aisles while I waited. The mix of caffeine I am usually stimmed out on and the ADHD I was born with makes it difficult for me to sit still. So, I was just kind of pacing around one of the corners of the store when I noticed something. Facing one of the refrigerators that lined the back of the store was a person sitting crisscross on the ground. It was such an odd sight that I initially overlooked it, then snapped my head back around to make sure I had not imagined it, and I had not. There was literally a person sitting on the ground at the end of the aisle, facing the refrigerator like he was examining it. I could not see anything other than the brown coat and jeans he was wearing. I needed to get a better look at this guy, at his face at least. So I walked a few aisles down. My plan was to turn the corner really quickly, get a good look at him, then turn back up one of the eyes ideally before he noticed me looking. Staring at strangers so explicitly is obviously really rude, so I did not want him to catch me doing it. I was trying to be inconspicuous about it, or at least appear like I was browsing the snacks. But I guess I did not do a good job of that, because as soon as I turned the corner to look at him, he whipped his head around and stared back at me. His movement was so abrupt that I actually froze up for a few seconds, forgetting what I was even doing there in the first place. And let me tell you, one look at this guy confirmed he was far from normal. Forget about the sitting on the ground and staring into the refrigerator. This guy was definitely on something, which I could tell from his abnormally wide eyes and the way his lip was vibrating, like it was quivering, almost as if he were cold, except it was actually hot in there, and he was also wearing a jacket. His posture was all twisted up too, like he was straining instead of sitting, if that makes any sense. But the worst thing by far was the look he was giving me. He was not smiling, and he was not scowling either. He was staring blankly at me with this dead stare that made it kind of seem like he actually was dead. The whole scene was freaky as hell. After staring at each other for an uncomfortable amount of time, I finally averted my eyes and dipped up one of the aisles, eager to get my food and leave. It was not ready yet, though. I stood at the counter and waited. The anxiety was getting to me. so I angled myself to face the corner of the store where the guy had been sitting. I was half expecting him to emerge from one of the aisles, at which point I am not sure what I would have done, but he never did. Eventually, my food was ready. I promptly left the store without another thought. I thought that was the end of it. But as I was turning to get back on the highway, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I glanced back towards the store and saw a person running full speed from the store entrance to the far end of the parking lot. I was already halfway onto the highway at that point, but as soon as I saw what looked like a brown coat, I knew it was him. As I drove past the quick check, I looked over at it one more time to see that guy was now jumping into a truck. I did not even want to imagine what a guy like that could possibly be rushing to do at 2 in the morning. I was just happy I had nothing to do with it. I sped off, just wanting to get home in peace. After a few minutes, the last of the fluorescent storefront lights faded into darkness behind me, and I was driving through desolate nothingness once again. I am used to being the only car on the road when it is that late at night, which is why it was so surprising when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. But it was even more surprising when I realized the headlights were getting closer, meaning they were going faster than me, and I was not exactly driving the speed limit. My first thought was that I was about to get pulled over, so I instinctively slowed down a bit. The headlights kept approaching, and I knew what was about to happen. Police lights were about to start flashing, and my night was about to be ruined. But once the car finally got close enough, I realized it was not a cop. It was that guy. That guy from the quick check. It was the same car from the parking lot. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I slammed my foot back on the gas and got back up to speed. The guy behind me started flashing his lights at me and honking, and I did not know what to do. Try and outrun him, or pull over and just pray that he would keep going. I was in a sedan and he was driving a pickup truck, so I figured I could outrun him. The faster I went, though, the more terrified I became. I can only describe that feeling as true terror. The feeling that you are literally approaching death. By the time I had gotten up to 100 miles per hour, the voice in my head was screaming that I was going to die if I kept accelerating. I swerved into the right lane, hoping he would shoot by me, but instead he actually swerved to stay behind me. I started slowing down with the intention of pulling over on the shoulder, but the moment I took my foot off the gas, the truck actually rammed into me. I grabbed the wheel to stabilize the car and realized I was in a life or death situation. The guy tailing me was trying to kill me. Everything was happening so fast I could not think. I knew he was going to try ramming me again, and at that speed, I knew I would be lucky not to spin out. I do not know if it was the terror or my survival instincts kicking in, but the moment I saw him go for it, I swerved to the left and slammed on the brakes. The truck shot past me, and I watched as he swerved back and forth a few times, before spinning out and shooting off the highway into the field. Despite how violently my hands were shaking and how terrified I was, I forced myself to start driving again. I sped the entire way home. As soon as I got inside, I called the police and reported the incident, although it is not like I could precisely describe where everything had gone down. They took my statement anyway, and I was happy to give it. I know for a fact that Quick Check had security cameras in their parking lot, so I am pretty confident they will end up catching that guy. It has only been a week since this happened, but I have not heard anything yet. My car is not dinged up too badly, but I still need to get it repaired. As for why in the world that guy had gone after me, your guess is as good as mine. I just hope I never see him again. This happened in the summer of 2022. I was 25 and working what I guess you would call an unusual logistics job. I was hauling refurbished electronics and custom PC parts for this last-mile delivery startup that was trying to compete with Amazon in weird rural markets. The routes were long and completely erratic. Sometimes I would be driving for 12 hours straight, often through the night, hitting these remote parts of the Southwest that most delivery companies refuse to touch. The pay was decent enough to make it worth it, and I did not mind the long drive since I had grown up in a road-tripping type family. This particular night, I was deep into the final leg of a Phoenix to Lovington run. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was winding through this desolate stretch of Route 82, past the outskirts of Lincoln National Forest in southern New Mexico. If you have never driven through that area at night, It is hard to describe how isolated it feels. The road is narrow and poorly lit. You might see another car every 20 or 30 minutes if you are lucky. But here is the thing about that particular stretch. It is also the only accessible route cutting through the area for miles. The GPS alternatives would add like 2 hours to the trip, winding you way north through Carrizo or something like that. So if you needed to get from point A to point B in that part of New Mexico, you pretty much have to take Route 82. Anyway, I was listening to some true crime podcast when I rounded this bend and saw a red hatchback awkwardly pulled onto the gravel shoulder with its hazards flashing. I slowed down a bit out of habit. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated a woman standing next to the car. She was holding her phone high in the air like she was trying to catch a signal. My first instinct was to just drive past. I mean, I am not heartless, but I am also not naive about the kinds of situations you can walk into in that part of the state at that time of night. But then I started thinking about my own girlfriend or my sister and how I would want someone to stop if they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Plus, I was not completely defenseless. I had a Glock 43 holstered just under my steering column. I never explicitly got permission from the company to arm myself, but given some of the areas we delivered to, it seems like common sense to me. I slowed down and cracked the passenger window a couple inches. The woman, who did not seem much older than me, rushed over immediately and tried my passenger door handle, which was locked. She said she needed a ride to the nearest gas station and claimed her car had just died and she could not get anyone on the phone. Her voice had this jittery quality to it, like she was either really stressed or maybe on something. I hesitated for a few seconds. The situation felt a little off, but what tipped the scale was knowing I had a firearm within reach. I figured if things got sketchy, I would be able to handle myself. So I unlocked the door. She got in quickly and gave me this vague and slightly slurred "Thank you so much," without really looking at me. The way she slurred her words made me think she was drunk or maybe a little tipsy, which made me a little cautious. Before driving away, I asked her some obvious questions. Had she hit something, or did the engine cut out, that sort of thing. But she kept deflecting, repeatedly asking me to just drive. Nothing she said really made sense, and I was leaning towards kicking her out of my car the more she talked. I was about to make a decision when I glanced over at her car one more time. To my horror, a man stepped out from behind it, like he had been hiding there the whole time. The adrenaline started to kick and I turned to face forward. There was another figure that had stepped directly in front of the road about 50 feet in front of us. There was something long in his hands, maybe a bat or a pipe. I could not tell exactly. He started moving toward my car, and that is when my survival instinct took over. I floored it. I did not even try to be subtle about it. The woman whipped around to look back and immediately started yelling. Then she reached down and started digging around in her purse for something. I had a feeling I knew what she was looking for. So before things could escalate, I yelled at her to freeze and drew my gun. I did not point it at her, but instead just rested it on the steering wheel so she could see it. Whatever she had been reaching for, she stopped immediately. I told her not to move and she did not. To my surprise, she stopped talking too. She just stared straight ahead with this expression I could not read. Luckily for her, we were less than 30 minutes from Artesia. After a somewhat tense half hour, I pulled into a gas station. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, both big rigs. I told her to get out. She refused at first and gave me some stupid reason I cannot remember. But I leaned across her, yanked the passenger door open, and basically forced her out of the truck. She stumbled back and fell onto the pavement, all the while yelling something completely incomprehensible. Someone started jogging over, probably one of the truckers, and I could already envision the accusations that were about to fly. All that guy had seen was me throwing a woman out of the car, and I did not want to deal with the situation for a second longer, so I did not. I yelled out a warning to him about her ill intentions, but that was all I was going to do. Then I peeled out of the lot before that guy could approach me and did not look back. I drove to another gas station and started filling my tank. Then I walked over to the passenger side to inspect the seat. Buried between the seat cushions was a burner phone battery and a sealed pack of zip ties. I did not even want to think about it. I tossed all of it in the trash and got back on the road, eager to be done with the journey. I never reported any of it. Not to the police, and definitely not to my company. Not because I did not think it was worth reporting, but because, legally speaking, I did not really want to explain to a bunch of cops why I was driving around armed, or why I had physically removed someone from my car. I am not going to get into it, but you can connect the dots on that one yourself. One thing is for sure though, being armed that night may have very well saved my life. This happened about 3 years ago, when my husband and I were driving cross-country from Utah to Georgia. Although the route we had mapped out was not the most direct, it passed through some places my husband really wanted to visit. The downside of that, though, was that we would be cutting through some pretty desolate stretches of highway. The worst part was this section of western Kansas, along US Route 400, basically 100 miles of nothing but farmland. We had been driving for most of the day, and I had fallen asleep in the passenger seat sometime around sunset. I am one of those people who can sleep anywhere in a moving car, so I was out cold for a few hours. Around 10 at night, I woke up to the car slowing down and realized my husband had pulled into this tiny gas station off the side of the highway. My husband said he was going to grab some snacks and fill up the tank. I figured it might have been my last chance for a while to use a real bathroom, so I got out and headed inside. I did not bother bringing my phone or purse with me. I mean, I was just going to be in and out, so I did not really see the need. The cashier was this older guy who did not even look up when I walked in. The bathrooms were tucked down this narrow side hallway toward the back of the store. As I opened the women's restroom door, I almost bumped right into this woman who was coming out of one of the stalls, which would not have been that noteworthy were it not for what she looked like. She had messy, unkempt gray hair that frankly looked kind of disgusting and oddly sticky. She was also wearing these foam flip-flops that made this soft slapping sound when she walked. As if that was not bizarre enough, what stood out the most was this thick purple and green coat she was wrapped in. Let me remind you, we were in Kansas in the middle of summer and it was probably 80 degrees out. She was carrying this tied-up plastic grocery bag, and when she saw me, she just stared. Not like a normal, "Oh, excuse me," kind of look, but this locked-on stare that felt weirdly expectant, like she was waiting for me to say or do something specific. I did not know what I was expected to do, so I just gave her a polite nod and tried to step around her, but she did not exactly rush to let me through. I figured that was the end of it, that she would leave me and I could get on with my life. But no, instead of leaving, the woman actually turned around to follow me and stepped toward the sink area. But she did not turn on the water, or look in the mirror, or do any of the normal things you do at a sink. She just stood there with her arms at her sides like she was. We think of police officers as authority figures, the ones who have control over every situation. But when they get called out to a scene in the dead of night, they have no idea what is actually waiting for them. They step into dark alleys, abandoned buildings, and thick woods, completely blind to the dangers lurking in the shadows. Today, we are sharing 4 haunting stories from former police officers who walked into routine calls only to come face to face with things that defied explanation. Our first story takes us to Floyd County, Georgia. Imagine being a police officer patrolling the quiet dirt roads late at night. For this officer, it was just another slow shift. The kind of night where the minutes feel like hours, and the only sound is the hum of your patrol car engine. The dirt roads in this area are flanked by dense, suffocating woods on both sides. There are no streetlights out here, just the high beams of your cruiser cutting through the pitch black. And then, as the officer was slowly driving down one of these isolated roads, he saw a sudden flash of movement. Right on the left side of the road, a figure suddenly leaped from the shoulder directly into the thick trees. It happened so fast that the officer only caught a glimpse of the person's lower half before they vanished into the darkness. The officer stopped his car. He turned the vehicle slightly to angle his spotlight directly into the spot where the person had disappeared. He stared into the trees, but the woods were too dense. He could not see anything. Now, most people would probably keep driving, but the problem was, it was this officer's job to investigate. He could not just leave it alone. So, with a heavy feeling of unease in his chest, he put the car in park and stepped out into the cool night air. The woods were dead silent. The officer reached down and put his hand on his holster, ready to pull his gun at a moment's notice. He began walking slowly toward the tree line, his flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks. At this point, the tension was incredibly high, and then the classic sound of a dry branch snapping echoed from behind a large oak tree. The sound was so close and so sudden that the officer almost bolted back to his car, but instead he took a deep breath, stood his ground, and yelled out into the darkness, ordering the person to step out into the light. To his surprise, a figure slowly stepped out from behind the tree. But what made the officer freeze was what this person was wearing. They had a strange, creepy mask covering their entire face. The officer immediately drew his weapon and pointed it at the masked figure. He yelled out, ordering them to raise their hands, take off the mask, and step forward slowly. The figure complied with the first part. They slowly raised both hands into the air, but they refused to take off the mask. They just stood there, staring at the officer through the eye holes. The officer, trying to assert his authority, raised his voice even louder, demanding that they remove the mask immediately. The figure looked as if they were about to reach up and pull the mask off. But then, they suddenly paused. They glanced quickly to their left, and then looked right back at the officer. In that exact moment, the officer heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps rustling through the dry leaves to his right. He swung his gun over, his heart hammering against his ribs. He yelled out as loud as he could, commanding everyone in the woods to show themselves with their hands up. He was absolutely terrified. And then, another figure stepped out from the darkness. This person was also wearing a mask. But the problem was, this second person was holding a large, heavy axe in their hand. Before the officer could even process this, more rustling sounds began echoing from every single direction around him. Footsteps were coming from the left, the right, and from deep behind the trees. The officer spun around in a panic, trying to track the movement. Within seconds, he was completely surrounded. There were at least 10 strangers, all wearing different masks, standing in a large circle around him. The only opening left was a narrow path directly behind him, leading back to his patrol car. Half of these masked individuals were holding axes, pipes, and other weapons. The officer stood there, his gun raised, but he was completely paralyzed. There were too many of them. If he fired a shot, he knew they would overwhelm him in seconds. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The silence in the woods was deafening, and then one of the masked figures finally broke the silence. In a deep, muffled voice, the figure simply said, "Go away." The officer did not say another word. He did not try to make an arrest. He turned around, sprinted as fast as his legs could carry him back to his cruiser, jumped inside and slammed the door. He locked the doors, put the car in drive, and sped down the dirt road at high speed. As he drove, his hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold the steering wheel. He grabbed his radio and called for every available unit to back up his position. A short time later, a massive search squad arrived at the scene. They flooded the woods with powerful lights and search dogs. But by the time they got there, the entire group was gone. There was no trace of the masked figures left behind. The officer would later develop a chilling theory about what happened that night. He believed that he had stumbled upon some kind of secret, dangerous group that was setting a trap for an innocent, unsuspecting driver. They were likely planning to block the road or lure a passerby into the woods to do something unspeakable to them. But because the officer happened to be driving a marked patrol car, the scout who jumped into the woods tried to hide, not realizing the officer had already seen him. If he had been driving a regular civilian car, he believed he would have been lured into those woods, and he might have never been seen again. Our second story takes us to a small, quiet village. A former officer recalls responding to a call about some suspicious noises coming from an old, abandoned 2-story convenience store. When the officer arrived, the building was completely stripped empty. He began his search on the first floor, checking every single empty aisle for anyone hiding in the darkness, but found nothing. He then went upstairs and checked the second floor, which was also completely empty. Believing the noises were just the wind, he headed back to his car, but as he looked back at the second floor window, he froze. A woman with long gray hair was staring straight down at him with a wide, disturbing smile. The officer immediately ran back inside and made it upstairs in less than 10 seconds, but the window was completely clear. He searched all 3 aisles 10 times, checked behind the counter and in the bathroom, but found no one. He figured his mind was playing tricks on him and walked back out. When he looked back at the window, There she was again, wearing the exact same mockingly creepy smile. Rattled, the officer charged back upstairs and began running around the aisles trying to find her. He was about to give up when something caught his eye on the ceiling. He shined his flashlight upward, and his heart stopped. The woman was clinging flat to the ceiling like a spider, holding onto two metal hooks with her hands while her feet were pressed against the ceiling tiles for support. She was staring directly down at him with that same terrifying smile. The officer arrested her and took her to the station. The entire ride, she stared at him through the mirror with that same unblinking smile. He never knew if she had a mental disability or was just playing a sick game, but her stunt was something he would never forget. Our third story involves two officers responding to a commercial motion sensor alarm at a newly converted doctor's office. When they arrived, a man claiming to be the key holder met them. Since the stairwell door was locked, he suggested they take the elevator to the second floor. When the doors opened, they stepped into a pitch-black hallway with a single light bulb at the far end. They checked the doors, finding all locked except for the last office. They entered and cleared the empty exam rooms. But when they stepped back into the hallway, they noticed something strange. The light that had been on was now dark, replaced by a light near the elevator. Even worse, all the office doors they had just confirmed were locked were now standing wide open. Suddenly, the main door slammed shut with force and their radios erupted with deafening static. Terrified, they rode the elevator back to the lobby, but the keyholder was gone. The officer radioed dispatch for the keyholder's phone number. The dispatcher responded that the keyholder was still 5 minutes away and had not arrived yet. When the real keyholder, a woman, finally arrived, she listened to the description of the man who had let them in. She went pale and explained that the description matched one of the doctors who used to lease that office, but he had committed suicide at his summer home several days prior. Our fourth and final story comes from a veteran officer who retired at 50 after 30 years of service. One night, he and his partner Steve responded to a domestic abuse call made by a neighbor. They arrived at the house to find the front door wide open and a powerful scent of marijuana and manufacturing chemicals filling the air. Hearing a loud thump from upstairs, they slowly made their way up. They found a closed door, and when they pushed it open, they were met with the sickening smell of human decay. In the dim light, they saw a heavily decomposed female body lying on the bed. Leaving Steve to secure the room, the officer searched the rest of the house. He approached a tiny windowless room with only a dirty old cot inside. Finding it empty, he was about to turn around when Steve let out a terrifying scream. The officer rushed back and saw a shirtless, wild-eyed man lying flat on top of a tall dresser, trying to press himself against the ceiling. Before they could arrest him, a hand reached out from under the bed and grabbed the officer's ankle, trying to pull him down. The officer stomped on the arm, pulling out a frail, drug-addled woman. They handcuffed both of them and began leading them out. Suddenly, a third man burst from an attic door, charging down the stairs with a raised knife. Steve reacted in a split second, shooting the attacker dead just 2 seconds before he could strike. It turned out the house was an active crack house, and the deceased woman on the bed had been killed by the shirtless man over drug money. The man was sentenced to life without parole, and the woman received 30 years. Steve never regretted his actions, knowing he had saved his partner's life and removed a dangerous threat from the world. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.